In March 1923, a telegram arrived at the British Museum that would become one of archaeology's most disturbing mysteries. Dr. Edmund Blackwood's expedition had been inside a sealed pyramid at Dashur for less than 48 hours when they sent 5 words. Request immediate extraction. Team disoriented. What they found inside defied every law of physics and reason. A chamber with impossible geometry where time moved differently. Hieroglyphs warning of walking between moments. Walls that shifted when not observed. A temperature that never changed despite the desert heat. And survivors who couldn't stop counting, convinced part of them never left. Within 3 weeks, 3 expedition members were dead. 4 were institutionalized. The rest would spend decades drawing impossible mazes, aging irregularly, reporting dreams in ancient languages they'd never studied. Their photographs showed shadows with no source. Their watches stopped at times that shouldn't exist. Even their descendants experienced the same temporal disorientation. Tonight, we enter the complete record from the confident photograph at the pyramid's entrance to the Iron Gate sealed in 1956. Still guarded, still forbidden, still counting. The telegram arrived at the British Museum on a Tuesday morning in March 1923. Its edges yellowed from the Egyptian sun, carried across 2 continents by hands that never questioned the weight of the words printed on that thin paper. The clerk who delivered it to the Department of Egyptian Antiquities noticed nothing unusual about the message itself, just another correspondence from the field, routine in the endless stream of communications between the museum and its far-flung expeditions. Harold Pemberton, the department's senior curator, unfolded the telegram with his morning tea still steaming beside him. The porcelain cup would remain untouched for the rest of the day, growing cold as the implications of those few terse lines settled over him like a shroud. The words were brief, almost clinical in their precision, stripped of all the flowery language that typically characterized academic correspondence of the era. Strange symbols found. Team disoriented. Request immediate extraction. Each word had been chosen with the economy that telegraph costs demanded, but even in that brevity, something fundamental felt wrong. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, who had signed the message, was known throughout the archaeological community as a man of unshakable composure, someone who had spent 3 decades working in the most challenging conditions the desert could offer without ever requesting early extraction from a site. His previous telegrams had detailed the discovery of intact burial chambers, unprecedented artifact finds, even the partial collapse of an excavation tunnel, all reported with the same measured tone one might use to describe the weather. But this message carried an undercurrent that Pemberton, who had known Blackwood for 15 years, immediately recognized as fear. The implications sent ripples through the archaeology department that would last for decades. Though in that initial moment, as Pemberton read and reread the telegram, he couldn't have known how far those ripples would spread. Within an hour, he had convened an emergency meeting with the museum's director and the Egyptian Antiquities liaison. By afternoon, urgent communications were being sent to Cairo, requesting information about the expedition's status and the possibility of sending a rescue team. But what made the message truly unsettling, what kept Pemberton awake that night and many nights after, wasn't what it said, but what it didn't say. There was no mention of what the strange symbols depicted, no explanation for the team's disorientation, no details about why a seasoned expedition leader with 4 decades of field experience would suddenly request extraction. It was signed by Dr. Edmund Blackwood, expedition leader and one of the most methodical archaeologists of his generation, a man who had trained at Oxford, worked at sites from Luxor to Saqqara, and whose published papers on Old Kingdom burial practices were considered definitive texts in the field. Blackwood's reputation for thoroughness was legendary. He never left a site without complete documentation, never made claims he couldn't support with physical evidence, never allowed emotion to cloud his scientific judgment. His previous expeditions had established the timeline for 3 previously unknown dynasties and had recovered artifacts that had fundamentally changed the understanding of ancient Egyptian daily life. Students sought positions on his teams knowing that the work would be grueling, but the experience invaluable. Museum boards competed for his services, and the Egyptian government trusted him with access to sites that remained closed to other foreign archaeologists. What made the telegram even more disturbing was the timeline. Blackwood's team had been inside the newly discovered chamber for less than 48 hours. In the world of archaeological excavation, where teams might spend months carefully documenting a single room, brushing away centuries of sand grain by grain, photographing every surface from multiple angles, measuring every dimension with obsessive precision, 48 hours was barely enough time to complete a preliminary survey. Yet something in that chamber had been powerful enough, disturbing enough, to break through Blackwood's professional detachment and prompt him to abandon a discovery that his initial reports had suggested might be the most significant find of his career. The last communication before the extraction request had arrived just 3 days earlier, filled with Blackwood's characteristic enthusiasm about architectural features. Unlike anything in the existing corpus, and inscriptions that may require us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about Old Kingdom religious practices, 17 miles south of Cairo, where the desert stretched endless and ochre toward a horizon that shimmered with heat even in winter, hidden beneath centuries of wind-blown sand and the accumulated debris of human forgetting, lay a structure that appeared on no official maps, no survey charts, no academic registers of known monuments. The pyramid at Dashur existed in that strange liminal space between myth and reality. Spoken of in the villages but dismissed by scholars, marked in no documentation, yet somehow persistent in the collective memory of those who lived in its shadow. It stood, or rather, lay buried in the southern section of the Dashur necropolis, a region known primarily for the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, those massive monuments to 4th Dynasty ambition that dominated the landscape and drew the attention of archaeologists and tourists alike. The structure wasn't unknown to locals, who had whispered about it for generations, calling it the House of Shadows in Arabic. Though the exact origin of this name had been lost to time, village elders spoke of strange lights sometimes visible at twilight, filtering up through cracks in the sand, and of a general reluctance among the Bedouin guides to camp in the structure's vicinity. These stories were typically dismissed by the archaeological community as the kind of superstitious folklore that accumulated around any ancient site, the result of generations of storytelling and the human tendency to project mystery onto the unknown. Yet the stories persisted with a consistency that was itself unusual, passed from grandfather to grandson, maintaining details that rarely varied even across families that had little contact with one another. But it had never been properly excavated, never been opened by modern hands, never been subject to the careful documentation and systematic investigation that characterized archaeological work in the early 20th century. Several factors contributed to this oversight. First, the structure's location in a region already rich with documented monuments meant that expedition funding naturally flowed toward the known sites, toward pyramids whose royal occupants could be identified, and whose hieroglyphic inscriptions promised publishable discoveries. Second, the structure's state of preservation, if the radar readings were to be believed, suggested a monument so badly degraded by time and the elements that many archaeologists assumed there would be little of value remaining inside. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the Egyptian Antiquities Service maintained a cautious approach to new excavations, particularly in regions where existing sites had not yet been fully documented and preserved. When survey equipment finally confirmed the structure's existence in late 1922, the readings were puzzling in ways that should have served as a warning, but instead only increased the archaeological community's interest. A British team conducting a comprehensive survey of the Dashur region using recently developed electromagnetic induction technology had picked up anomalous readings from an area that, on the surface, appeared to be nothing more than a natural rise in the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar showed hollow chambers where there should have been solid stone, vast spaces deep beneath the surface that seemed to violate every known principle of pyramid construction. The Fourth Dynasty builders, limited by the technology available to them and working with enormous blocks of limestone and granite, had created internal chambers through carefully engineered spaces carved from solid bedrock or corbelled into the pyramid's mass. But the readings from this structure suggested cavities that extended far beyond what the apparent size of the pyramid could contain, spaces that seemed to branch and interconnect in ways that made no architectural sense. The magnetic instruments spun wildly near the northern face of the structure, their needles jerking between compass points as if responding to some unknown force beneath the sand. This phenomenon alone should have been impossible. The limestone and granite typically used in pyramid construction contained minimal ferromagnetic material, certainly not enough to affect sensitive instruments. Some members of the survey team suggested that perhaps an iron-rich meteorite had struck the site in ancient times, its impact creating magnetic anomalies in the surrounding rock. Others proposed that the instruments were simply malfunctioning in the desert heat, though the readings remained consistent across multiple visits and different equipment. A few, speaking only in private, wondered whether something had been deliberately buried at the site, something meant to be found by future generations, equipped with tools to detect it. The Egyptian Antiquities Service granted Blackwood's team exclusive access to the site in January 1923, a decision that reflected both Blackwood's sterling reputation and the service's own curiosity about what might lie beneath the sand. The permission came with the usual conditions. All findings were to be documented thoroughly. All artifacts remained property of the Egyptian state, and any discoveries of significance were to be reported immediately. Blackwood signed these agreements without hesitation, as he had done dozens of times before, never imagining that within weeks these papers would become evidence in an investigation that would ultimately be sealed away in the British Museum's archives, marked restricted access and filed under a catalogue number that didn't appear in any public registry. The photograph shows 11 people standing before the pyramid's entrance, captured in that peculiar quality of early 20th century photography, where the subject seems simultaneously present and distant, frozen in a moment that belongs irrevocably to the past. The image was taken on February 1st, 1923, 2 days before the team entered the main chamber, and it represents the last moment when everyone in the frame was still whole, still themselves, still living in a world where the ground beneath their feet felt solid and reality operated according to rules they understood. The composition is formal, arranged with the care typical of expedition photography, where images served both documentary and promotional purposes, meant to illustrate scientific achievement and British competence in equal measure. Their faces are clear in the sharp desert light that photographs so beautifully in Egypt, that crystalline quality of illumination that reveals every detail with unforgiving precision. Dr. Blackwood stands in the centre of the group, his position reflecting his role as expedition leader, one hand resting on a limestone block that had been removed from the entrance passage, his expression one of confidence mixed with the quiet satisfaction of a man about to make a significant discovery. He wears the standard expedition attire of the period: khaki work clothes, boots suitable for rough terrain, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the relentless Sunday. His posture suggests authority, tempered by approachability, the bearing of a man accustomed to leading teams in difficult conditions. At 53, Blackwood was at the height of his career, his position in the archaeological community secure, his methods respected, his future promising. To his right stands expedition photographer James Whitmore, holding his camera, the very instrument that captured this moment and that would capture images inside the chamber that no one outside the expedition would ever see. Whitmore was 28, technically skilled and known for his ability to work in the challenging conditions that underground photography required. His equipment, visible in the photograph, represents the cutting edge of archaeological documentation. A large format view camera capable of producing negatives of extraordinary detail, supplemented by magnesium flash powder for illuminating dark spaces. Whitmore's journal, recovered months after the expedition's collapse, would provide the most detailed account of what happened inside the chamber, though many who read it would question whether the events he described could possibly be real, or whether they represented the deteriorating mental state of a man pushed beyond the breaking point. What makes the image disturbing, beyond anything visible in its composition, is the knowledge of what happened next, the weight of subsequent events that transforms this innocent documentation of scientific endeavor into something that carries the charge of prophecy or premonition. Within 3 weeks of this photograph being taken, 3 of the people standing in this neat row would be dead under circumstances that the official reports would describe as unfortunate accidents, while the unofficial whispers spoke of suicide, madness, and terror. Dr. Margaret Chen, visible in the photograph's left side, would be found at the bottom of a shaft inside the pyramid, her body broken in a fall that the investigation could never definitively classify as accident or intentional act. Technical assistant David Porter would die in Cairo, officially from a sudden heart condition, though those who saw his body reported an expression of such profound fear that several witnesses refused to enter the room where he lay. 4 others would be institutionalized, committed to facilities for nervous disorders, where they would spend months or years in varying states of lucidity, speaking when they spoke at all of things that doctors dismissed as delusions, but that showed troubling consistency across separate accounts. They spoke of walls that weren't walls, of geometry that hurt to perceive directly, of hieroglyphs that moved when observed peripherally, and of a presence in the chamber that wasn't hostile exactly, but was so fundamentally other, so completely alien to human experience, that sustained exposure to it fractured something essential in the mind. The remaining 4 survivors, including Whitmore, would refuse to ever speak about what they found inside, turning away from careers they had trained for all their lives, abandoning the field of archaeology entirely, and in some cases relocating to remote places where the past seemed less likely to reach them. When the team finally breached the sealed entrance on February 3rd, 1923, after 3 days of careful excavation to clear the passage and ensure the structure's stability, the air that escaped was described in multiple accounts with the same puzzling phrase, neither hot nor cold, but somehow wrong. This consistency across different witnesses is significant because it suggests they were all responding to the same objective phenomenon, though what that phenomenon might have been remains unclear. The atmosphere that emerged from the opened passage didn't carry the stale, dead quality typically associated with sealed chambers that had remained unopened for millennia. It didn't have the thick, dusty character that usually accompanied the first breach of an ancient tomb, when the exhalations of centuries would flow out in a visible cloud. Instead, witnesses described it as active in some way, as if the air itself possessed a quality that none of them could quite articulate, but that all of them recognized as fundamentally abnormal. The passageway descended at an angle of exactly 26.5 degrees, a measurement that Blackwood himself verified and recorded in his journal, noting with satisfaction that it matched the standard angles found in pyramids of the 4th dynasty. This attention to architectural detail was typical of Blackwood's methodical approach, and the discovery of traditional construction techniques initially suggested that the structure would conform to familiar patterns, that whatever surprises it held would be variations on known themes, rather than complete departures from established understanding. The passage walls were smooth limestone, expertly cut, showing the characteristic tool marks left by copper chisels. The ceiling was corbelled in the traditional manner, each stone carefully shaped to distribute weight and prevent collapse. For the first 47 meters of descent, Everything about the passage suggested a conventional pyramid interior, and the team's initial reports reflected confidence that this would be a significant but comprehensible discovery. But after 47 meters, at a point that Blackwood marked precisely in his survey notes, the passage opened without warning into a chamber that defied every known principle of pyramid construction, that violated the accumulated wisdom of decades of archaeological study, that simply should not have been possible given the technology available to Fourth Dynasty builders. The transition was abrupt, with none of the gradual widening that typically preceded a chamber entrance. One moment the team was moving through a passage barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast, and the next, they were standing at the threshold of a space so vast that their lights couldn't immediately reach its far walls. The ceiling rose to a height that their measuring equipment would eventually determine to be 18 meters, yet it bore no support columns, no corbelling, no visible means of supporting the weight of stone that must have rested above it. This absence of structural support wasn't just puzzling. It was, according to every principle of ancient engineering, impossible. The limestone blocks used in Fourth Dynasty construction, while strong, had definite limits to their load-bearing capacity. A ceiling span of this width, supporting what must have been hundreds of tons of stone, should have required multiple columns or some form of internal buttressing. Yet the chamber's ceiling appeared to be a single continuous surface, smooth and unmarked, showing none of the jointing that would indicate separate blocks laid side by side. Modern engineers who later reviewed the expedition's measurements and photographs would struggle to explain how such a structure could have remained standing for 3,000 years. Some suggested that perhaps the chamber had been carved from solid bedrock, but geological surveys of the region showed no rock formation of sufficient size to contain such a space. The walls were covered in hieroglyphs that senior Egyptologist Dr. Margaret Chen, who held a doctorate from Cambridge and had published extensively on Old Kingdom religious texts, later described in her preliminary report as grammatically perfect but semantically impossible. Chen's expertise was sufficiently established that this assessment couldn't be dismissed as the confusion of someone unfamiliar with ancient Egyptian writing systems. She knew the grammar, the syntax, the ideological frameworks that informed Old Kingdom inscriptions. What disturbed her about the hieroglyphs in this chamber was that while she could read every symbol, while the grammar conformed perfectly to Fourth Dynasty standards, the meaning that resulted from reading the text made no sense. The inscriptions seemed to be instructions, formatted in the imperative mood, typically used for ritual directions, but instructions for what? She couldn't say. They spoke of opening, of seeing what stands behind, of speaking names that echo in the place between. But the objects of these verbs, the concrete nouns and specific deities that should have anchored the meaning, were either entirely absent or replaced with terms that had no referent in the known corpus of Egyptian religious texts. According to Whitmore's journal, recovered months later from his apartment in London where he had retreated after leaving Egypt, carefully archived in leather-bound volumes that showed evidence of obsessive, repeated handling, the disorientation began on the second day inside the chamber, manifesting in ways that were initially so subtle that individual team members wondered if they were imagining the effects. The journal entries, written in Whitmore's precise hand, become increasingly frantic as the days progress. The handwriting deteriorating from neat script to barely legible scrawl, though the content remains detailed, suggesting that despite his growing distress, Whitmore maintained his professional commitment to documentation. He recorded temperatures, light readings, the positions of team members, and most importantly, the strange phenomena that began to accumulate like a gathering storm. Team members reported difficulty maintaining their sense of direction, claiming that they would sometimes lose track of which way they had entered the chamber, that the passage they had descended just hours before would somehow seem to be in a different location relative to the chamber's other features. Initially, these reports were easy to dismiss. Underground spaces are naturally disorienting, particularly when lit only by portable lamps that create pools of light separated by absolute darkness. The human sense of direction, which relies heavily on reference points like the position of the sun and recognizable landmarks, often fails in subterranean environments. But as the complaints accumulated, a pattern emerged that was harder to explain through normal psychological mechanisms. Team members reported feeling that the walls seemed to shift when they weren't looking directly at them, that they would mark a particular wall feature, look away to examine something else, and then discover that the marked feature had somehow moved. These reports were so consistent across different team members that Blackwood ordered a detailed survey of the chamber, assigning team members to measure distances between specific points and then verify those measurements from different positions. The results should have been reassuring. The measurements were consistent, confirming that the chamber's physical dimensions remained stable. Yet even with this empirical confirmation, the sense of spatial distortion persisted. Several team members reported experiencing a form of vertigo when looking at certain wall sections, describing it as if the surface was simultaneously flat and deeply recessed, as if their eyes were reporting one configuration, while some other sense insisted on a different truth. Whitmore's journal includes several attempts to photograph these sections, hoping that the camera's mechanical objectivity would resolve the contradiction, but the resulting images showed nothing unusual, just flat wall surfaces covered in hieroglyphs. Watchers ran backward for several minutes before correcting themselves, a phenomenon that multiple team members observed simultaneously, ruling out the possibility of individual equipment failure or subjective misperception. Dr. Henry Collins, the expedition's technical specialist, first noticed the problem during a routine time check on February 4th. His pocket watch, a reliable chronometer that he had carried on expeditions for 15 years, showed the hour hand moving counterclockwise. He assumed the watch had somehow been damaged, perhaps by the dramatic temperature changes between the desert surface and the cool chamber interior. But when he pulled out the watch to examine it more closely, the hands had resumed their normal clockwise motion. When Collins mentioned this incident to others, 3 team members reported identical experiences with their own timepieces. They conducted an experiment, synchronizing their watches and then monitoring them closely over the course of an hour. Twice during that period, all 4 watches simultaneously ran backward for periods ranging from 3 to 7 minutes before self-correcting. A compass brought into the chamber spun freely, unable to find magnetic north, its needle rotating with no apparent pattern or purpose, as if the chamber existed outside the Earth's magnetic field entirely. This discovery was particularly troubling because, unlike the reports of spatial disorientation or temporal anomalies, it was an objective, measurable phenomenon that couldn't be attributed to psychological factors. Dr. Blackwood initially attempted to explain it through the same theoretical meteorite impact that had been proposed to explain the magnetic anomalies detected during the site survey. But when team members carried the compass out of the chamber and up the passage to the surface, it immediately resumed normal functioning. The needle locking onto north with its usual stability, the boundary between normal magnetic response and complete dysfunction was sharp and unmistakable, occurring at the exact threshold where the passage opened into the chamber. Dr. Blackwood dismissed these reports as exhaustion and confined air, falling back on conventional explanations rather than confronting the possibility that the phenomena they were experiencing might be real and unprecedented. His journals from this period, later reviewed by a committee of inquiry, show a man increasingly committed to rational explanations, even as the evidence accumulated against them. He ordered increased ventilation, using portable fans to draw fresh air down the passage. He insisted on reduced working hours, believing that fatigue was causing perceptual errors. He arranged for team members to rotate out of the chamber in shifts, spending time on the surface to rest and recover. But the phenomena persisted, and if anything, they intensified. Blackwood's last coherent journal entry was dated February 5th, 2 days before the telegram that would end the expedition, and it shows a man beginning to doubt his own judgment while still clinging to the frameworks of scientific rationality that had guided his entire career. He wrote, "The hieroglyphs continue to trouble Dr. Chen. She insists they must be translated from within the chamber itself, that their meaning is somehow contextual, dependent on being read while physically present in this space. I find this claim metaphysically suspect, yet I cannot deny that my own attempts to understand them have been more disturbing than illuminating. When I read them while standing at the chamber's center, they seemed to mean something, to convey a message just at the edge of comprehension. But when I review my notes on the surface, that sense of meaning evaporates, leaving only a collection of words that parse grammatically but convey nothing. We will continue documentation tomorrow, though I confess a growing reluctance to spend extended periods in that space." Dr. Chen spent 14 hours copying the chamber's inscriptions before the first breakdown occurred. Working by the light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the ancient walls, she meticulously documented every symbol, every curve and line of the mysterious text. Her transcriptions, now held in the British Museum's restricted archives under catalogue number BM-EA 2024.15, contain symbols that don't appear in any other Egyptian text discovered before or since. The anomalies were immediately apparent to Chen, who had spent 2 decades studying Egyptian writing systems. Some symbols matched predynastic scripts from 3500 BCE, millennia before the pyramid was supposedly built during the 4th dynasty. The presence of these archaic forms in what should have been a later structure defied everything archaeologists understood about the evolution of Egyptian writing, but even more disturbing were the symbols that resembled no known writing system at all, from any culture or time period. The translation Chen managed before her hospitalization spoke of concepts that seemed alien to ancient Egyptian thought. Where typical pyramid texts focused on the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife and appeals to protective deities, these inscriptions dealt with something entirely different. They described walking between moments and the weight of time made solid. Phrases that seemed more philosophical than religious, more scientific than spiritual. The final passage she copied, working with increasingly trembling hands, warned that those who measure what cannot be measured will themselves be measured and found wanting. Chen underlined this passage 3 times in her notebook, adding a marginal note that simply read, "What does this mean? Who is doing the measuring?" What makes Chen's work particularly valuable is that she was the only team member with the linguistic expertise to attempt any translation at all. After the expedition's collapse, several other Egyptologists examined her transcriptions, and their conclusions were deeply troubling. Dr. Sarah Morrison of Oxford University noted that the grammar structures were inconsistent with any period of Egyptian language development. Professor Heinrich Müller from Berlin observed that the symbols appear to www shift meaning depending on their position, as though the text itself is somehow fluid. Most disturbing was the observation by Dr. James Whitmore, who specialized in ancient measurement systems. He noticed that the spacing between certain hieroglyphs followed a mathematical progression that matched quantum mechanical formulas not discovered until the 20th century. When confronted with this impossibility, Whitmore could only conclude that it was either an extraordinary coincidence or we're fundamentally misunderstanding what we're looking at. Chen herself, during her brief periods of lucidity in the psychiatric facility, would only say that the inscriptions were trying to teach us something we're not ready to understand. She died 3 months after the expedition. Her final words reported by her attending physician as, "The symbols are still there, even when I close my eyes." 3 team members independently reported hearing a low humming sound that seemed to emanate from the chamber walls themselves. The phenomenon began approximately 6 hours after they entered the newly discovered space, though each person experienced it at slightly different times. What made this particularly unsettling was that the sound appeared to be inaudible to recording equipment, despite multiple attempts to capture it using the expedition's state-of-the-art audio technology. Assistant archaeologist David Mills wrote in his notebook with increasing desperation about the sensation. His entries, preserved in the expedition archives, described the sound as felt rather than heard, like it was inside my skull vibrating through my teeth. Mills, who had perfect pitch and had played violin since childhood, attempted to identify the frequency using tuning forks from the equipment supplies. He estimated it was around 19 hertzes, just below the threshold of human hearing but within the range known to cause profound psychological effects. Modern research has shown that infrasound at this frequency can induce feelings of anxiety, dread, and even visual hallucinations. The human eye's resonant frequency is approximately 18 hertzes, meaning that sounds in this range can cause the eyeball itself to vibrate, potentially producing optical illusions. But this knowledge wasn't available to Mills in 1923. He only knew that something was profoundly wrong, and that the sound was getting louder with each passing hour. Mills's condition deteriorated rapidly. His handwriting and subsequent entries became increasingly erratic. The words scattered across pages in patterns that almost resembled the hieroglyphs on the chamber walls. He began to complain that the sound was showing him things, though he couldn't or wouldn't elaborate on what those things were. Other team members, in their own journals, noted Mills standing motionless for hours, his head tilted as though listening to something they couldn't hear. Mills was the first to be evacuated. Found on February 6th wandering the desert 2 miles from the pyramid, he was discovered by a Bedouin trader walking in a perfectly straight line toward the east, convinced he'd been inside the chamber for years, maybe centuries. His clothing was shredded, his skin severely sunburned, but he showed no awareness of his condition. When asked how he'd gotten so far from the pyramid, Mills could only respond that he'd followed the sound to where it was quietest. The rescue team that found him reported that Mills was counting under his breath, an endless sequence of numbers in no recognizable order. Medical examination showed no physical cause for his condition. His hearing was perfect. There was no evidence of drug use or infection, yet Mills never recovered his mental clarity. He spent the remaining 7 years of his life in a psychiatric facility, always claiming he could still hear that terrible sound, growing louder year by year. Those who knew Edmund Blackwood described him as unshakable, a man whose rational mind had solved some of Egypt's most puzzling archaeological riddles. A graduate of Cambridge with degrees in both archaeology and mathematics, Blackwood had built his reputation on methodical analysis and careful documentation. He had excavated sites across Egypt for 15 years without incident, maintaining detailed records that other scholars praised for their precision and clarity. The change in him was therefore all the more striking to those who had worked with him for years. In his final journal entry, dated February 7th, 1923, his handwriting had deteriorated from the precise script that had characterized decades of field notes to barely legible, a scrawl that slanted wildly across the page. The transformation hadn't been gradual. Comparing entries from just hours apart showed a shocking decline, as though years of aging had occurred in the span of a single day. Blackwood wrote obsessively about patterns in the stone that move when time isn't looking, filling pages with observations that grew increasingly disconnected from archaeological methodology. He described the chamber walls as breathing, and claimed the hieroglyphs were rearranging themselves to tell different stories depending on when you looked at them. These weren't the observations of a trained scientist, but the ravings of someone whose grip on reality had catastrophically failed. Most disturbing were the calculations that covered the margins of his final journal entries. Complex mathematical notation filled every available space. Equations that began with recognizable formulas but quickly diverged into symbolic systems that made no sense. Dr. Michael Ashford, a mathematician at Cambridge who later examined these notes, reported that Some of the notation resembles early attempts at describing non-Euclidean geometry, but then transforms into something that doesn't follow any known mathematical rules. When the rescue team finally extracted Blackwood on February 12th, they found him sitting motionless in the chamber's center, exactly where he had positioned himself hours, or perhaps days earlier. He was staring at the eastern wall, his lips moving in what appeared to be counting, though the numbers he spoke made no mathematical sense. He was counting backward, his voice barely audible. 17, 34, 8, 93, 2. The rescue workers had to physically carry him from the chamber. Blackwood showed no resistance, but also no awareness of their presence. His eyes remained fixed on that eastern wall until they had carried him completely out of the pyramid. Only when they emerged into the desert sunlight did he finally blink. And in that moment, something in his expression suggested a terrible relief, as though he had been released from a burden beyond human comprehension. Blackwood spent his final months at a private sanatorium in Surrey, paid for by the Royal Archaeological Society. He never spoke coherently again. Though nurses reported that he continued his counting, the same seemingly random sequence of numbers repeated endlessly until his death in August 1923. His physician noted that Blackwood died exactly at 3:47 a.m., though the significance of this timing would only become apparent when other expedition records were examined. The Egyptian authorities dispatched a rescue team on February 8th. The moment Blackwood's desperate telegram reached the offices in Cairo, the message had been brief and chilling. Chamber effects worsening. Request immediate extraction. Situation critical. It was the last coherent communication from the expedition, transmitted from the telegraph station in the nearest village, where Blackwood had apparently travelled in his final moments of clarity. The rescue team, led by Captain Ahmed Hassan of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, consisted of 8 experienced men who had conducted numerous desert operations. They assembled their supplies with practiced efficiency, expecting a straightforward if urgent mission. But it took them 4 days to reach the site, fighting sandstorms that seemed to intensify the closer they came to Dashur. Hassan's official report described conditions that defied meteorological explanation. The wind came from all directions simultaneously, Hassan wrote. Our compass needles spun uselessly. On the final day, we found ourselves walking in circles for 3 hours, despite maintaining what we believed to be a straight course. It was as though the desert itself was trying to keep us from reaching the pyramid. When they finally entered the pyramid on February 12th, they found the expedition's equipment scattered across the chamber floor in a pattern that suggested both haste and confusion. Notebooks lay open to blank pages, as though someone had been frantically trying to document something that refused to be recorded. Cameras with their lenses shattered from the inside sat among overturned crates. The glass fractured in patterns that specialists later described as impossible without tremendous internal pressure. 3 team members were missing entirely, never to be found. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, photographer Thomas Wright, and surveyor John Collins had simply vanished. The chamber showed no hidden passages, no collapsed sections where bodies might be trapped. The 3 had been present when Blackwood sent his telegram, and yet no trace of them remained beyond personal effects that told no story of their fate. The Egyptian authorities conducted extensive searches, but the trio had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. The rescue workers themselves reported feeling an oppressive weight in the chamber, as though the air had become measurably thicker the longer they remained. Hassan described a pressure on his chest, like being underwater, and several men complained of difficulty breathing despite normal oxygen levels. One rescuer, Mohammed Khalil, collapsed after just 10 minutes inside, later reporting that he felt as though he were being pressed between 2 enormous stones. Most significantly, none would agree to enter the pyramid a second time. These were men accustomed to the dangers and discomforts of archaeological work, veterans of numerous excavations in difficult conditions, Yet every single member of the rescue team refused subsequent assignments to the Dashur site. Hassan himself, in a confidential note to his superiors, recommended that the chamber be sealed immediately and the pyramid declared off-limits. Within a month, his recommendation was quietly implemented, though no official explanation was ever provided. One of the expedition's most puzzling aspects was the timeline, a discrepancy that defied logical explanation and suggested something fundamentally wrong with how the team had experienced their time in the chamber. According to Blackwood's journal, carefully maintained despite his deteriorating mental state, the team spent 5 days inside the newly discovered space. His entries were dated February 3rd through February 7th, each day's observations meticulously recorded despite the increasingly disturbing content. But the rescue team arrived only 2 days after the telegram was sent on February 8th. The mathematics were simple and inescapable. If Blackwood's journal was accurate, he had somehow sent a telegram dated February 8th, describing events that, according to his own records, had occurred the day before. This wasn't merely a dating error. The journal entries themselves referenced specific events and observations across 5 distinct periods that Blackwood clearly perceived as separate days. When confronted with this discrepancy during their initial medical evaluations, surviving team members insisted they had been inside for much longer than the official timeline suggested. Dr. Chen, in one of her few coherent moments, claimed the expedition had lasted at least a week, possibly more. David Mills, before his complete breakdown, told rescue workers they had been underground for many days, though when pressed, he became agitated and couldn't provide a specific number. The physical evidence only deepened the mystery. Watches recovered from the site showed wildly different times, some hours apart, despite having been synchronized before entering the chamber. This was standard practice for expeditions, ensuring all team members could coordinate their activities. Dr. Mitchell's pocket watch, found near the chamber's entrance, showed 11:23. Blackwood's wristwatch, still on his arm when he was evacuated, read 3:47. Mills's watch had stopped at 7:15. These timepieces had been within minutes of each other less than a week before. Most puzzling was Thomas Wright's watch, discovered in the debris scattered across the chamber floor. The watch had stopped at 3:47, but in a configuration that watchmakers later declared should have been mechanically impossible. Both the AM and PM hands were pointing to the same position, as though the watch was trying to indicate 2 different times simultaneously. When the watch was examined by experts at Dent, London's premier watchmaker, they found no mechanical defect that could explain the phenomenon. The internal mechanisms were intact, but the hands had somehow frozen in a position that violated the basic principles of the watch's design. Temperature measurements added another layer of confusion. Food supplies left in the chamber showed signs of decomposition, consistent with a week or more of exposure to warm temperatures, not the 2 or 3 days that had objectively passed. Yet equipment batteries, which should have lasted a week according to their specifications, were completely drained, as though they had been in use for far longer than physically possible. Dr. Eleanor Hawthorne, a physicist from Cambridge who was brought in to examine the evidence, concluded that either every timepiece malfunctioned in a perfectly coordinated fashion, which is virtually impossible, or the team experienced some form of temporal distortion we don't have the theoretical framework to explain. Her report, buried in the expedition archives, posed a question that remained unanswered. If time can move at different rates within that chamber, what other physical laws might behave unexpectedly there? Against explicit orders and all archaeological protocols, several team members removed objects from the chamber during the expedition's final chaotic hours. This was particularly unusual given Blackwood's reputation for strict adherence to preservation guidelines. Throughout his career, he had been known to discipline team members severely for even the smallest breach of excavation procedures. Yet, in those last days, either desperation or some inexplicable compulsion led multiple expedition members to pocket artifacts whose significance they couldn't have fully understood. A stone scarab was found in James Whitmore's pocket during the medical examination following his rescue. The scarab, carved from a type of black stone that geologists later struggled to identify definitively, measured approximately 2 inches in length. Its underside was carved with symbols that seemed to shift in different lighting, a phenomenon that several observers noted, but none could adequately explain. When photographed under consistent illumination, the symbols appeared different in each image, as though they were somehow changing between exposures, or the camera itself couldn't capture their true form. Dr. Chen had wrapped a fragment of papyrus in her notebook, pressed between pages of her own translation attempts. When questioned during her lucid periods, she had no memory of taking it, insisting that she would never violate such fundamental archaeological ethics. The papyrus, despite its apparent age, was in remarkably good condition, with ink that seemed as fresh as if it had been applied recently. It showed a diagram of what appeared to be the chamber itself, rendered with precise architectural detail that matched the actual space perfectly. But the diagram included additional rooms that the team had never found, chambers that extended beyond the known boundaries of the pyramid structure. These phantom rooms were depicted in the same careful detail as the actual chamber, suggesting they were not mere decorative elements but genuine architectural spaces. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted years later would find anomalies in precisely the locations indicated by the papyrus diagram, though expeditions to explore these potential spaces have never been authorized. Most disturbing was the small statue discovered in Blackwood's belongings during the inventory of expedition materials. The figurine stood approximately 6 inches tall, carved from the same unidentifiable black stone as Whitmore's scarab. It depicted a man in ancient Egyptian dress, but with his head turned completely backward, staring at something behind him with an expression that observers described as beyond horror, almost transcendent. The statue was cold to the touch, even in the desert heat, maintaining a temperature several degrees below ambient, regardless of environmental conditions. When placed in direct sunlight for hours, it remained cool. When stored in refrigeration, it felt no colder. Its temperature seemed fixed at exactly 15 degrees Celsius, a property that thermodynamics couldn't explain. Materials scientist Dr. Robert Chang examined it in 1965 and concluded that the statue was either violating the second law of thermodynamics or drawing heat from a source we can't detect. Blackwood's personal effects also included 17 pages of notes, written in a hand that seemed to progressively deteriorate from his careful script into something barely recognizable as writing at all. These notes, apparently written while holding or contemplating the statue, described the man who looks backward through time and made references to seeing what has already happened as though it were still happening. The final page contained only a single sentence, written over and over in increasingly frantic script. He sees me seeing him. See me. The British Museum eventually took possession of all 3 artifacts, cataloguing them under restricted access protocols that remain in place to this day. The scarab is stored in a sealed lead container in the museum's deep archives. The papyrus is kept in a climate-controlled vault with limited exposure to light. The statue is housed in its own secure room, where temperature monitoring equipment records its unchanging 15-degree temperature every hour. An eternal thermodynamic impossibility that continues to defy explanation. Dr. Sarah Morrison, the psychiatrist assigned to treat the survivors at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, noticed something peculiar as she conducted extensive interviews during the spring and summer of 1923. Morrison, who had specialized in treating shell-shocked soldiers during the Great War, was accustomed to the varied presentations of psychological trauma. But the expedition survivors displayed symptoms that followed an unnervingly consistent pattern, unlike anything in her previous clinical experience. Each person who had entered the chamber described the same progression of symptoms with remarkable uniformity. First came temporal disorientation, typically beginning approximately 36 hours after initial entry into the chamber. Subjects reported difficulty tracking the passage of time, with minutes feeling like hours or hours compressing into moments. They described looking at their watches and being unable to reconcile the indicated time with their subjective experience of duration. Dr. Chen told Morrison that she would begin copying an inscription, believing only minutes had passed, only to discover that her colleagues insisted hours had elapsed. Conversely, she described periods where she believed she had worked for an entire day, filling pages of notes, only to be told she had been writing for less than an hour. This wasn't simple absorption in work. It was a fundamental disconnect between experienced time and measured time. The second phase involved visual distortions, typically emerging 48 to 60 hours after entry. Subjects reported that the chamber walls appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting in slow, rhythmic patterns. The hieroglyphs seemed to move when observed peripherally, returning to their original positions when viewed directly. Shadows fell in directions that didn't match the light sources, and some team members reported seeing additional people in the chamber who weren't actually present, not hallucinations of strangers, but phantom versions of their actual teammates, standing in multiple locations simultaneously. Finally, after approximately 72 hours of exposure, came a complete detachment from consensus reality. This was the stage where individual experiences began to diverge more dramatically in content while maintaining similar underlying structures. Some, like Mills, became convinced they had been in the chamber for years. Others, like Blackwood, began perceiving patterns and meanings in the stonework that existed only in their altered perception. All shared a conviction that they had learned something fundamental about the nature of reality. Though none could articulate what that knowledge was, the timeline was consistent across all subjects, taking approximately 36 hours from entry to the first symptoms, regardless of individual factors like age, education, or prior psychological history. Morrison found this mechanistic progression deeply disturbing. Psychological trauma typically manifested based on individual resilience, personal history, and countless other variables. Yet the chamber's effects seemed to operate more like a toxin or infectious disease, following predictable stages with clinical precision. But the severity varied wildly in ways that Morrison couldn't predict or explain. Some, like Mills, recovered after weeks of intensive treatment, eventually able to return to something approximating normal life, though they never fully regained their previous psychological baseline. Mills himself was released from care after 2 months, deemed stable enough to return home, though he never worked in archaeology again and avoided enclosed spaces for the rest of his life. Others, like expedition geologist Thomas Wright, never regained coherence, spending his remaining 12 years in institutional care. Wright's particular obsession was creating elaborate mazes that looped back on themselves in ways that violated Euclidean geometry. He would spend hours drawing these impossible structures, filling page after page with increasingly complex labyrinths that seemed to exist in more than 2 dimensions. When asked about his drawings, Wright would only smile and say he was mapping the pathways time takes when it isn't being observed. Morrison compiled a detailed report of her findings, including careful documentation of the symptom progression and her observations about the mechanical nature of the psychological deterioration. Her report concluded with a statement that effectively ended her involvement with the case. Whatever affected these men was not psychological trauma in any conventional sense. They've been exposed to something that has fundamentally altered their neurology, perhaps even their basic perception of physical reality. I can treat the symptoms, but I cannot address the underlying cause, because I do not understand what that cause is. The museum launched its own investigation, though the results were never published, and the expedition's existence was deliberately obscured in official records. Internal documents, declassified only in 1998 under Britain's 30-year rule for sensitive government materials, reveal that they sent a second, smaller team to the pyramid in late October 1923, nearly 8 months after Blackwood's disastrous expedition. The museum's governing board, concerned about both the loss of valuable team members and the potential for revolutionary archaeological discoveries, authorized this follow-up mission despite the obvious risks. This second team was deliberately kept small and consisted of individuals selected for their psychological stability and scientific skepticism. Professor Harold Stevens, a veteran archaeologist known for his dismissal of supernatural explanations, led the group. He was accompanied by Dr. Michael Winters, a physician with psychiatric training, and James Crawford, a photographer whose documentation skills were considered the finest in British archaeology. Their mission was simple: enter the chamber, document what Blackwood's team had found, and return within a strictly enforced time limit of 2 hours. The team entered the chamber on October 23, 1923, equipped with gas masks in case of toxic air, safety ropes attached to support pillars they installed at the entrance, and multiple synchronized chronometers to avoid the temporal confusion that had plagued the first expedition. They carried enough oil lamps to illuminate the entire space and had strict instructions to leave immediately if any team member reported unusual symptoms. They reported severe psychological distress within the first 30 minutes. Stevens's field notes, written in increasingly shaky handwriting during the expedition, describe an overwhelming sense of wrongness that intensified the longer they remained in the chamber. Winters, the physician, noted elevated heart rates and blood pressure in all 3 team members, physiological stress responses that occurred despite no obvious threat or exertion. After 1 hour and 43 minutes, Crawford had to be physically restrained from removing his safety rope and venturing deeper into the chamber. He claimed he could hear voices calling from beyond the walls, speaking in a language he couldn't identify but somehow understood. His photographs from this expedition, preserved in the museum archives, show nothing unusual, just empty stone passages and walls covered in hieroglyphs. Yet Crawford insisted that he had photographed the spaces between moments, and that the true images would only become visible when time shifted perspective. At the 2-hour mark, Stevens made the decision to evacuate, but Professor Stevens himself resisted leaving, arguing passionately that they were on the verge of understanding, and that abandoning the investigation now would be an irretrievable loss to science. It took both Winters and Crawford to physically remove him from the chamber, with Stevens fighting their efforts and shouting calculations that made no mathematical sense. Stevens later wrote, in a private journal that wouldn't be discovered until his death in 1956, that he had finally understood something in those 2 hours, but could never articulate what that understanding was. His entries became increasingly cryptic over the following weeks. The chamber isn't a room, it's a lens. Time doesn't flow there, it pools. They built it to look at something that shouldn't be looked at. His final entry on the subject, dated November 15th, 1923, read simply, "I should have stayed." Whatever price it demanded would have been worth paying for true understanding. Stevens resigned from the museum 3 weeks after the expedition, citing personal reasons in his formal letter of resignation. He abandoned archaeology entirely, spending his remaining years teaching mathematics at a small boarding school in Devon, far from anything connected to ancient Egypt. Colleagues who visited him described a man fundamentally changed, someone who seemed to be looking past the present moment into something else, something that left him perpetually distracted and vaguely melancholic. The museum's board of trustees met in emergency session on November 30th, 1923, and made a decision that would shape their policy for decades to come. All records of both expeditions were sealed. The chamber's location was deliberately obscured in official publications. No further expeditions to the Dashur pyramid would be authorized under museum auspices. The decision was unanimous, and according to the declassified minutes, the discussion lasted less than 20 minutes. Whatever the board members read in Stevens's official report convinced them that some discoveries were too dangerous to pursue. When Dr. Chen's transcriptions were analysed by mathematicians in the 1960 seconds, as part of a broader academic interest in mathematical principles in ancient architecture, they revealed something completely unexpected that would have profound implications for how scholars understood ancient Egyptian knowledge. Dr. Robert Hammond, a mathematician at MIT with an interest in archaeoastronomy, was the first to notice the patterns while examining Chen's careful copies during research for a paper on geometric principles in pyramid design. The spacing and arrangement of the hieroglyphs followed mathematical ratios that wouldn't be formally described until the 20th century. Hammond's initial analysis revealed the golden ratio, approximately 1.618, appearing repeatedly in the proportional relationships between symbol sizes and the distances between inscribed lines. This in itself wasn't entirely shocking. The golden ratio appeared in other Egyptian architecture and art, but the precision and consistency with which it was applied in the chamber inscriptions exceeded anything found in other Egyptian sites. More remarkably, Hammond identified what seemed to be references to irrational numbers, mathematical constants that cannot be expressed as simple fractions. The number pi appeared in the angular relationships between certain hieroglyphs, accurate to 4 decimal places. The square root of 2 was encoded in the proportional heights of specific symbols. These weren't approximations or coincidental measurements. They were precise values deliberately incorporated into the inscription design. Most puzzling was a sequence that appeared to describe the Fibonacci sequence in reverse 13. 8, 5, 3, 2, 1. 1 represented not in Arabic numerals, but in the proportional sizes of a series of bird hieroglyphs that decreased in scale across a single wall panel. The Fibonacci sequence, in which each number is the sum of the previous 2, wouldn't be introduced to Western mathematics until the 13th century, and the ancient Egyptians had no known symbolic representation for this mathematical concept. Dr. Elena Rostova, a Soviet mathematician who independently analysed Chen's transcriptions in 1967, made an even more startling discovery. One mathematician noted that the inscriptions treated time as a spatial dimension, with equations that placed past, present, and future as coordinates on an axis. Rostova identified symbolic representations that functioned like variables in modern physics equations, with certain hieroglyphs appearing to represent time coordinates just as others represented physical distances. The inscriptions included what appeared to be transformation equations, mathematical relationships that described how measurements in one time coordinate could be converted to equivalent measurements in another. This was conceptually similar to how Einstein's special relativity treats time as a fourth dimension that can be mathematically related to spatial dimensions. But these inscriptions predated Einstein by more than 4 millennia. The implications were impossible, yet the mathematics was sound. When Rostova attempted to treat the hieroglyphic equations as genuine mathematical statements and solve them using modern techniques, she found they produced consistent, meaningful results. They described relationships between temporal and spatial coordinates that were mathematically valid, even if the physical reality they described seemed to violate causality. As we understand it, Hammond published a controversial paper in 1969 titled Temporal Mathematics in Ancient Egyptian Inscriptions, which was immediately criticized by Egyptologists for over-interpreting decorative artistic choices as mathematical statements. Yet Hammond's mathematical analysis was rigorous and peer-reviewed by other mathematicians who confirmed his findings. The symbols and their arrangements did indeed follow these sophisticated mathematical principles, regardless of whether the ancient Egyptians understood them as such. The most unsettling aspect of Hammond's analysis was his conclusion about the inscription's purpose. He wrote, "If these are indeed mathematical statements about the nature of time, they suggest the chamber was designed as a kind of experimental apparatus, a physical space where the normal relationship between time and space could be deliberately altered. The inscriptions aren't just describing temporal mathematics. They're providing instructions for manipulating time itself. Chen's transcriptions included one sequence that Hammond spent 3 years attempting to decode. It appeared to be an equation relating the chamber's physical dimensions to temporal measurements, suggesting that the room's size and shape were specifically calculated to produce particular temporal effects on anyone inside. The equation implied that time would flow at different rates at different positions within the chamber, with the differential increasing exponentially the longer someone remained inside. When Hammond finally published his full analysis in 1972, he included a warning in his conclusion. These inscriptions suggest a level of mathematical and physical understanding that should not have been possible in the ancient world. Either our entire framework for understanding ancient Egyptian knowledge is fundamentally flawed, or we are completely misinterpreting what these symbols mean. But if the mathematics is correct, and if the chamber was indeed designed according to these principles, then Dr. Blackwood's expedition may have been exposed to physical conditions that violate our understanding of how time operates. Predictably, the press latched onto the idea of a curse with the enthusiasm that newspaper editors reserved for stories that combined ancient mystery with British tragedy. Pyramid's curse claims British expedition ran the headlines in the Daily Mail on February 15th, 1923. The Times was more restrained, but no less suggestive. Mysterious illness strikes archaeological team. Within days, the story had spread internationally, with papers from New York to Sydney reporting on what they characterized as the latest chapter in the saga of Egyptian curses that had begun with the Tutankhamun discovery just months earlier. The curse narrative had a powerful appeal. The recent publicity surrounding Lord Carnarvon's death shortly after entering Tutankhamun's tomb had primed the public for stories of ancient Egyptian vengeance against those who disturbed sacred spaces. Journalists wrote breathlessly about ancient warnings and the revenge of the pharaohs, often inventing colourful details about inscriptions that threatened death to intruders, though no such inscriptions existed in the Dashur chamber. But those close to the case knew it was more complex than simple superstition. The symptoms didn't match typical curse narratives, which usually involved mysterious deaths from ancient toxins or sealed air laden with lethal bacteria. There were no dramatic fatalities, no sudden unexplained illnesses that could be attributed to environmental hazards. The medical examinations of expedition members found no evidence of biological or chemical poisoning. Their blood was clean, their organs healthy, their bodies physically intact. Instead, there was something more insidious at work, a kind of mental unravelling that seemed to follow precise, almost mechanical patterns. Dr. Morrison noted in her private correspondence with colleagues that the survivors weren't traumatized in the conventional sense that she had seen in war veterans or accident victims. They had been changed at a fundamental level, as if they'd seen something that rearranged how their minds processed reality. The temporal disorientation, the consistent symptom progression, the mathematical precision of the effects these suggested something far removed from mystical curses or ancient vengeance. Hammond, the mathematician who analysed the inscriptions, wrote to Morrison in 1971, "A curse implies intent, agency, a force that chooses to harm. What happened in that chamber appears to be more like a natural phenomenon, perhaps a physical property of the space itself. The ancient Egyptians may have discovered something about the nature of time and space and built a structure that manipulated those properties. The effects on the human mind would be incidental, not a punishment, but simply the inevitable result of exposing human consciousness to conditions it wasn't designed to withstand." Morrison herself came to reject the curse theory entirely, though she struggled to articulate what had actually occurred. In a 1956 letter to Dr. Hammond, she wrote, "I've spent 3 decades thinking about those men and what happened to them in that chamber. The more I learn about physics and the nature of time, the more I believe they were victims not of any curse, but of an ancient experiment whose purpose we still don't understand. They walked into a space where time itself behaved differently, and their minds couldn't adapt to that fundamental violation of physical law. What we called madness may have been the only rational response to an impossible situation. The curse theory persisted in popular culture, of course. Books were written, television documentaries produced, countless articles published, all framing the Blackwood expedition as another example of ancient Egyptian mysticism claiming modern victims. But in academic circles, among those who actually examined the evidence, a different understanding gradually emerged. The chamber at Dashur wasn't cursed. It was something potentially more frightening. A place where the fundamental laws of physics operated differently, where human consciousness confronted something it had no evolutionary framework to process, where the boundary between past, present, and future became dangerously permeable. The question wasn't whether the expedition had been cursed. The question was whether humanity was ready to understand what the ancient Egyptians had actually built in that chamber, and whether that understanding might prove more dangerous than any mythological curse could ever be. After his death in 1947, Whitmore's estate released his photographs from the expedition, a collection that had been locked in a bank vault for 24 years per his explicit instructions. The will stipulated that the photographs could only be made public after his death, a curious provision that his family never fully understood. When the sealed container was finally opened, it contained over 300 glass plate negatives and corresponding prints, each meticulously labelled with date, time, and exposure settings in Whitmore's precise handwriting. Most showed standard archaeological documentation, carefully lit shots of the chamber walls and artifacts that would have been invaluable to researchers, if not for the expedition's troubled history. The technical quality was exceptional, showcasing Whitmore's considerable skill as a photographer. His lighting captured the depth and texture of the carved hieroglyphs with remarkable clarity, but scattered among these routine images were photographs that made no sense whatsoever. Several photographs of the same wall section, taken minutes apart according to Whitmore's meticulous notes, showed the hieroglyphs in different positions, not dramatically different. The changes were subtle enough that they might have been missed if not for Whitmore's systematic approach to documentation. A bird symbol that appeared in the upper right corner of one photograph would be positioned several inches lower in the next image. Taken just 8 minutes later, according to his log, a sequence of 3 staff hieroglyphs arranged vertically in one shot appeared horizontally in another, taken 10 minutes afterward. Photographic experts from Kodak examined the original negatives in 1948, searching for evidence of manipulation or double exposure. They found none. The emulsion showed no signs of tampering, no scratches or alterations that would indicate darkroom manipulation. These were genuine, single-exposure photographs. The camera itself, a Graflex 4x5 that Whitmore's family had preserved, was examined by optical engineers and found to be functioning normally, with no defects that could explain the anomalous images. A shot of the chamber's ceiling included what appeared to be a human figure standing upside down on the stone surface, as though gravity operated differently in that specific location. The figure was somewhat indistinct, more shadow than substance, but clearly humanoid in form and proportion. No expedition member recalled seeing anything on the ceiling, and the team's daily logs made no mention of any such observation. Yet there it was, captured on film, impossible to explain away as a trick of light or shadow. Most disturbing was a self-portrait. Whitmore took inside the chamber, using a mirror and cable release, a common technique for documenting the photographer's presence at significant sites. The image showed Whitmore standing with his camera, his face clearly visible in the reflection. But in the curved surface of his camera lens, barely visible even under magnification but unmistakably present, was a second photographer standing directly behind him. This figure also held a camera, positioned as though photographing the same scene from a different angle. The silhouette was crisp enough to show the distinctive shape of a Graflex camera, identical to Whitmore's own. The expedition had only one photographer, yet the photographic evidence suggested otherwise, raising a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. Who was the second person with a camera in that sealed chamber? Research teams in the 1,950 seconds, conducting systematic surveys of Egyptian archaeological sites, measured the chamber's temperature at a constant 20 degrees Celsius, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Regardless of the external desert heat that could reach 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit, during summer afternoons. This consistency was noted during visits conducted across different seasons and times of day. Morning measurements taken at 6 a.m. showed 20 degrees Celsius. Afternoon readings at 2 p.m., when the desert surface temperature exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, still showed 20 degrees Celsius. Winter measurements, when nighttime desert temperatures could drop to 10 degrees Celsius, remained unchanged at 20 degrees Celsius. The chamber maintained this temperature without any apparent ventilation or cooling mechanism. Unlike other pyramid chambers that showed temperature fluctuations corresponding to external conditions with a time lag, this chamber seemed completely isolated from ambient temperature changes. The limestone walls should have conducted heat from the sun-baked exterior or released stored heat during cool nights, yet the chamber remained perfectly stable. Thermographic cameras, relatively new technology in the 1,950 seconds, were brought into the chamber by a joint British-Egyptian research team in 1957. The equipment showed no heat signatures from the walls whatsoever, as if the stone itself existed at some null point of thermal energy. Normal stone, even at moderate temperatures, should have emitted infrared radiation detectable by the cameras. The chamber walls appeared as complete thermal voids, registering no temperature at all on the infrared spectrum. This shouldn't have been possible given the pyramid's construction materials and the fundamental physics of heat transfer. Limestone has well-documented thermal properties. It absorbs heat, stores it, and releases it over time. The chamber's walls were the same limestone as the rest of the pyramid structure, verified by core samples, yet they behaved as though they existed in a separate thermodynamic system. Dr. James Richardson, a physicist from Cambridge who participated in the 1957 survey, suggested the chamber might be thermally isolated from its surroundings through some unknown mechanism. He proposed that perhaps the chamber's specific geometry or some property of the carved hieroglyphs created an acoustic or electromagnetic effect that somehow interfered with heat transfer. But he admitted he couldn't explain how ancient Egyptians could have achieved this without modern materials, advanced mathematics, or any understanding of thermodynamics as we know it. The Egyptian government commissioned a follow-up study in 1959, bringing in thermal engineers and physicists to solve the mystery. They introduced controlled heat sources into the chamber, portable electric heaters that raised the local air temperature by several degrees. Within minutes of the heaters being switched off, the temperature returned to exactly 20 degrees Celsius, as though the chamber were actively resisting any thermal change. The walls absorbed the excess heat instantly, far faster than the thermal mass of limestone could account for. The engineers concluded that the chamber appeared to exist in its own microclimate, somehow separate from the normal rules of heat transfer and thermal equilibrium, operating on principles that defied conventional physics. 3 survivors developed an obsessive need to count, a compulsion that began within weeks of their rescue and intensified over the following years. They would count their steps as they walked, count the words they spoke in conversation, count the seconds between heartbeats. The counting was constant, relentless, all-consuming. Family members reported that the survivors would wake from sleep counting and would count continuously until exhaustion forced them back into unconsciousness. When prevented from counting aloud, they would count silently, their lips moving in endless enumeration, their fingers tapping out sequences against their legs or tabletops. If physically restrained from any external expression of counting, they became increasingly agitated, their anxiety escalating until they were permitted to resume their counting behavior. The compulsion was so powerful that it overrode basic needs. Survivors would forget to eat while counting, would count through meals when forced to sit at tables, would interrupt their own speech mid-sentence to verbalize particularly important numbers. Dr. Morrison theorized this was a coping mechanism, an attempt to impose order on minds that had lost their natural sense of sequence and causality. The chamber had disrupted their temporal perception so fundamentally that they needed to manually track the progression of moments through counting. She wrote in her case notes, "They are trying to measure time the way one might measure distance with a ruler, compensating for an internal sense of duration that the chamber has somehow broken. But the numbers they counted followed strange patterns that suggested something more than simple enumeration. They weren't counting sequentially 1, 2, 3, 4, but rather following complex sequences that seemed meaningful to them but appeared random to observers. Careful documentation revealed they were counting prime numbers 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, arranged in patterns that occasionally jumped backward or skipped forward, according to some internal logic no one else could discern. One survivor, Alice Pemberton, kept notebooks filled with her counted sequences. Mathematicians who examined these notebooks in the 1,960 seconds found that her numbers, when plotted graphically, formed sinusoidal waves with periods that matched the orbital resonances of planets in the solar system. Another survivor's sequences, when analyzed, corresponded to the Fibonacci sequence multiplied by prime numbers. The mathematical sophistication was far beyond anything these individuals had studied or could consciously understand. When Alice Pemberton was asked during a rare moment of clarity why she counted, she paused, her lips still moving silently, and replied with chilling simplicity, "Because if I stop, time will notice me again." She wouldn't elaborate on what this meant, but the implication was clear. The counting somehow kept her hidden from whatever temporal distortion had affected her in the chamber. As long as she maintained her careful enumeration of moments, she remained safely anchored in normal time. To stop counting was to risk slipping back into the temporal chaos she had experienced in that buried stone room. Segment 19. The Chamber's Sealed Records. In 1956, the Egyptian government permanently sealed the Dashur chamber, welding a heavy iron gate across the entrance and posting armed guards with orders to prevent any unauthorized access. The official reasons cited structural instability and concerns about the pyramid's deteriorating condition. Standard justifications for closing archaeological sites, but declassified documents from the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, released in 2003 under Freedom of Information requests, tell a very different story about why the chamber was so abruptly and permanently closed. A brief Egyptian military survey in 1952, conducted as part of a broader assessment of archaeological sites for potential tourism development, had sent 3 soldiers into the chamber with instructions to map its dimensions and assess its safety. The soldiers were experienced military personnel, chosen specifically for their reliability and level-headedness. They entered the chamber at 10:15 a.m. on March 17, 1952, carrying measuring equipment, flashlights, and a radio for communication with the surface team. All 3 emerged after 90 minutes, reporting severe disorientation and experiences that matched the symptoms Blackwood's expedition had described nearly 30 years earlier. They complained of time feeling wrong, of being unable to trust their sense of how long they had been underground. One soldier, Corporal Hassan Ibrahim, insisted they had been inside for at least 6 hours, despite his watch showing that only 90 minutes had elapsed. Most troubling was the report from Private Ahmed Khalil, who claimed in his official statement that the chamber was much larger on the inside than the outside. He described walking for extended periods through passages that should have led beyond the pyramid's physical boundaries. Yet somehow, always returning to the central chamber. His testimony was supported by the other two soldiers, both of whom corroborated that the chamber's interior dimensions seemed impossible given the pyramid's external measurements. A surveying team was dispatched to verify these claims. Their precise measurements proved the soldiers' perception was geometrically impossible. The chamber's interior space could not be larger than the physical volume of stone surrounding it. Yet all three soldiers maintained their account, insisting that their experience of the space didn't match what the measurements indicated. The incident report, marked confidential and filed directly with the Minister of Antiquities, included a recommendation from the survey commander. This site presents hazards that we cannot explain or mitigate. Further access should be prohibited until we better understand the cause of these psychological effects. The Egyptian Antiquities Service convened an emergency meeting on April 3rd, 1956, and voted unanimously to seal the chamber permanently. The decision was implemented within days, and the chamber has remained sealed ever since, a locked door to mysteries that no one has been willing to reopen. Before her death in 1967, Dr. Margaret Chen gave one final interview about the expedition to a young graduate student named David Walsh, who was researching temporal perception disorders for his dissertation. By then, Chen had spent 4 decades in and out of psychiatric care. Her once brilliant career reduced to a cautionary tale told to overeager archaeologists about the dangers of obsession and isolation. She was 69 years old, frail and diminished, living in a private care facility outside London, paid for by a trust the British Museum had quietly established for expedition survivors. Walsh expected little from the interview. Chen's medical records documented decades of delusions, paranoia, and episodes of complete dissociation from reality. Previous researchers had attempted to interview her over the years, but she had been largely incoherent, speaking in fragments about hieroglyphs that moved and time that flowed backward. But on this particular afternoon in late autumn, Chen was lucid for the first time in years, her eyes clear and focused in a way that startled the attending nurse. In that interview, recorded on a portable tape machine and later transcribed, Chen described what she had actually seen in the chamber, speaking with a clarity and precision that recalled her former academic brilliance. "The hieroglyphs weren't instructions," she said, her voice steady despite her physical frailty. "Everyone assumes ancient texts are meant to teach us something, to pass down knowledge or preserve history. But these weren't like that. They were warnings." She paused, staring past Walsh toward the window, where autumn leaves fell in spirals outside. "They were trying to tell us that the chamber wasn't a tomb. It was never meant to house the dead. It was a door, a threshold, a boundary between what is and what might be. And doors work both ways. That's what we missed. What we were too excited to understand." Her hands trembled as she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We were so focused on what we might find on the other side, what knowledge we might gain, what mysteries we might solve, that we never considered what might be looking back at us, what might notice us standing there, measuring and photographing and recording, trying to understand something that was never meant to be understood by minds that experience time in only one direction." Chen died 3 weeks after that interview, her death attributed to heart failure. But Walsh, in his notes, recorded something the attending physician told him confidentially. Chen's final words, spoken in the moments before she lost consciousness for the last time, were in a language no one recognized. Syllables that seemed to flow backward, sentences that ended before they began. Dr. Edmund Blackwood's personal papers were donated to the British Museum after his death in 1941, a bequest that arrived in 3 sealed trunks, accompanied by a letter from his executor requesting they be kept in the restricted archives. Among them were hundreds of pages of calculations, diagrams of the chamber drawn from every conceivable angle, and attempts to translate the hieroglyphs into mathematical formulae that grew increasingly complex and abstract over the years following his rescue. His notes grew increasingly fragmented as the years progressed, filled with marginalia that suggested a mind still grappling with what he had experienced in that sealed stone room. Phrases like "time has weight" appeared in the margins of architectural drawings. "The stones, remember," was written repeatedly across pages of mathematical notation. "Duration is not constant," appeared beside sketches of the chamber's proportions. These weren't the careful observations of a rational archaeologist, but the obsessive fragments of someone trying to articulate something beyond language. The diagrams themselves were remarkable in their precision and obsessive detail. Blackwood had drawn the chamber from every conceivable angle straight on, from corners, from imagined positions outside the physical structure. He sketched the hieroglyphs individually and in sequences, attempting to find patterns in their arrangement. Some drawings showed the chamber as it existed physically. Others showed what Blackwood labelled temporal configurations, versions of the same space that somehow existed at different times simultaneously. Most puzzling was a sealed envelope found at the bottom of the third trunk, labelled in Blackwood's careful handwriting, to be opened only if they find another chamber. The envelope had been placed there sometime in the 1930 seconds, judging by the paper and ink. Museum curators debated for months whether to open it, given the specific conditions Blackwood had set. Finally, in 1952, during the brief period when Egyptian authorities were considering reopening the Dashur site, the decision was made to unseal the envelope. Inside was a single sentence, written in Blackwood's increasingly shaky hand: "Don't let them synchronize." No explanation, no context, just that cryptic warning. No one knows what he meant by synchronize, whether he referred to people, objects, timepieces, or something else entirely. Was it a warning about coordinating activities within the chamber? About aligning equipment or measurements? About human minds achieving some dangerous harmony with whatever temporal distortion existed there? The note was filed with the rest of Blackwood's papers, where it has remained for over 70 years, an answer to a question no one fully understands. No second chamber has ever been officially found, though the 1998 satellite survey would later suggest their existence within the pyramid structure. Blackwood's warning remains unheeded because no one comprehends what they should avoid synchronizing, or what catastrophe such synchronization might produce in a space where time itself behaves impossibly. In 1973, acoustics researchers from Cairo University obtained permission to conduct sonic analysis outside the sealed chamber, part of a broader study of resonance properties in ancient Egyptian structures. They aimed specialized equipment at the iron gate that had sealed the entrance since 1956, sending precisely calibrated sound waves through the small gaps in the welded metal. The equipment recorded the returning echoes with sophisticated instruments that could detect minute variations in frequency and timing. The results were immediately classified by the Egyptian government for 25 years, an unusually long restriction for what was supposed to be routine archaeological research. When the data was finally released in 1998, researchers discovered why the findings had been suppressed. The sound waves sent into the chamber returned altered in ways that violated basic physics. Their frequencies shifted in patterns that suggested they had travelled much further than the chamber's physical dimensions allowed. The acoustic analysis had sent multiple sound pulses into the chamber simultaneously, each at a different frequency to create a comprehensive acoustic map. But the echoes didn't return together as they should have. Some echoes came back minutes after others, despite being sent at exactly the same time. The delays seemed random at first, but careful analysis revealed they followed a pattern. Echoes at lower frequencies returned first, while higher frequencies were delayed, the opposite of how sound normally behaves in enclosed spaces. Even more disturbing was an observation made by Dr. Youssef Mahmoud, the lead acoustics researcher. He noted in his report that the echoes seemed to return in reverse order, as if time inside the chamber flowed differently than outside. A pulse sent at frequency A followed by frequency B should produce echoes in the same sequence. Instead, the B echo sometimes preceded the A echo, arriving before its cause had been completed. The equipment had recorded other anomalies as well. Some sound waves apparently never returned at all, as though they had been absorbed or had travelled so far they exceeded the equipment's detection range. Others returned amplified rather than diminished, having somehow gained energy during their journey through what should have been an empty stone room. The principle of conservation of energy suggested this was impossible. Sound waves should lose energy as they travel, not gain it. Most troubling was a recording made accidentally after the main experiment had concluded. The equipment, left running during the researchers' lunch break, captured what sounded like echoes returning more than 30 minutes after the last sound pulse had been sent. These delayed echoes were faint but unmistakable, suggesting that something in the chamber had somehow stored the sound energy and released it gradually over time, or that the sound had taken an impossibly long path through a space that measured only 30 feet across. Investigators uncovered 3 earlier incidents that bore striking similarities to the Blackwood expedition, suggesting the Dashur chamber was not unique in its effects. The first occurred in 1884, when a French team, led by archaeologist Pierre Durand, began exploring a different sealed chamber discovered in Saqqara during routine excavation work. Durand's brief published report mentioned atmospheric conditions that caused disorientation and stated the excavation had been abandoned for safety reasons, but his private letters, found in French National Archives decades later, told a different story. Durand described temporal disorientation identical to what Blackwood's team would experience 39 years later. His team reported losing track of time, experiencing visual distortions, and feeling an overwhelming sense of wrongness that intensified the longer they remained in the chamber. 2 team members suffered complete nervous breakdowns. Durand himself wrote that the chamber seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time, though he couldn't explain what he meant by this. The chamber was quietly sealed, and Durand never conducted archaeological work again. In 1901, a German expedition to Abu Rawash, led by Professor Heinrich Schäfer, encountered similar phenomena. Their report, published in an obscure German archaeological journal, described chambers with unusual hieroglyphs and rooms that existed at different times simultaneously. Schäfer wrote of seeing the same space in multiple states empty and furnished, pristine and ruined, depending on where he stood and how he looked. His colleagues corroborated these observations, but struggled to articulate what they had witnessed. The expedition withdrew after 1 week, leaving the site unexplored. Most disturbing was an American team's experience at Maydam in 1912. The expedition, sponsored by the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, reported losing a team member named Robert Morrison, who simply vanished while documenting a newly discovered chamber. He was found 3 days later wandering the desert 15 miles from the excavation site, with no memory of the missing time and no explanation for how he had travelled so far. Medical examination showed severe dehydration and sunburn, but no physical injuries. Morrison could only say that he had stepped through a moment that didn't end and found himself outside with no recollection of leaving. None of these incidents were widely publicised beyond brief mentions in academic publications. All involved chambers with unusual hieroglyphs that bore similarities to those Dr. Chen would later transcribe at Dashur. All featured mathematical proportions that followed ratios similar to the Golden Ratio and Fibonacci sequences, and all were subsequently sealed by local authorities, with varying official explanations about structural instability or preservation concerns. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked. Certain ancient Egyptian chambers produced consistent, reproducible effects on human consciousness that authorities preferred to hide rather than study. In 1989, theoretical physicist Dr. Marcus Lindholm of Uppsala University proposed a controversial explanation that attempted to reconcile the archaeological evidence with known physics. He suggested the chamber might have been designed as a temporal marker, a kind of anchor point that existed simultaneously across multiple time periods, a fixed point in space-time that could be accessed from different moments in history. Lindholm's theory argued that the hieroglyphs weren't instructions or historical records, but rather coordinates, mathematical descriptions of how to perceive time non-linearly, as a dimension that could be navigated rather than simply experienced sequentially. The symbols, he proposed, described relationships between temporal coordinates, the way a map describes spatial relationships, allowing observers to perceive the chamber as it existed in past, present, and future simultaneously. The psychological effects on the expedition team, in this theory, resulted from human minds trying to process a space that existed outside normal causality. Human consciousness evolved to perceive time linearly, with clear distinctions between past, present, and future. When exposed to a space where these distinctions broke down, where all moments existed simultaneously, the mind had no framework for processing the experience. The result was the temporal disorientation, visual distortions, and eventual psychological collapse that characterized the expedition survivors' symptoms. Lindholm suggested that the ancient Egyptians might have possessed a more sophisticated understanding of time than modern physics credited them with, perhaps through philosophical or mystical insights that accidentally aligned with quantum mechanical principles. The chamber could have been constructed as a religious or ceremonial space designed to allow priests to experience time differently, to perceive past and future as the gods supposedly did. The theory gained some attention in fringe physics circles, but was never formally published in mainstream journals. The problem was fundamental. Lindholm could provide no mechanism for how such a space could be constructed with ancient technology. Creating a genuine temporal anomaly would require manipulating spacetime itself, something that demands either enormous masses moving at relativistic speeds or exotic matter with negative energy density. Bronze Age Egyptians had access to neither. Without a plausible construction method, the theory remained interesting speculation rather than serious science. Yet Lindholm's mathematical analysis of the chamber's proportions, based on Dr. Chen's transcriptions and architectural surveys, did reveal something intriguing. The ratios and relationships encoded in the chamber's design matched theoretical descriptions of closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, potentially allowing information or even matter to travel backward in time. Whether the ancient builders understood this or stumbled upon it accidentally remains unknown. At least 5 expedition survivors reported having the same recurring dream over the years following their rescue, a shared experience that Dr. Morrison documented extensively in her case files but could never adequately explain. The consistency of the dream across multiple individuals who had no contact with each other after the expedition suggested something more than coincidence or shared trauma. The survivors described standing in the chamber, alone but somehow aware of others nearby existing in different times. They watched the hieroglyphs move across the walls like shadows cast by invisible objects, the symbols shifting and rearranging themselves in fluid patterns. In the dream, they understood what the symbols meant perfectly, could read them as easily as their native language, comprehending not just individual meanings, but the complex mathematical and temporal relationships the inscriptions described. The knowledge felt complete in the dream, absolute and unquestionable. They understood the chamber's purpose, knew why it had been built and what it was meant to accomplish. They grasped the mathematical principles that allowed time to pool and eddy in that space. They comprehended what the ancient builders had discovered about the nature of reality and consciousness. For those dream moments, they possessed knowledge that would revolutionize human understanding of physics and temporality. But the knowledge faded the moment they woke, evaporating like morning dew in sunlight, leaving only the certainty that they had known something crucial. Some survivors could remember fragments for a few seconds after waking, partial equations, glimpses of symbols, half-formed concepts about the relationship between consciousness and time. but these fragments dissolved rapidly, leaving behind only frustration and an aching sense of loss. One survivor, David Mills, kept a notebook by his bed and tried to write down what he'd learned, training himself to begin writing immediately upon waking before full consciousness returned. The pages were filled with symbols that matched no known writing system, drawn in what appeared to be his sleep. The symbols were precise and consistent, suggesting they weren't random scribbles but genuine attempts to record something. Linguistic experts who examined the notebook found no matches in any documented language, though the symbols showed consistent internal logic, suggesting they represented a true writing system rather than meaningless marks. Dr. Morrison theorized the dreams represented the mind's attempt to process and integrate the impossible experiences from the chamber, recurring because the integration could never be completed. Human consciousness, she suggested, had recorded something it couldn't consciously access, and the dreams were the unconscious mind's efforts to bring that information into awareness through symbolic representation. Evidence suggests a deliberate effort to suppress information about the Dashur expedition, a coordinated campaign that extended across institutions and national boundaries over decades. The pattern of suppression was too consistent, too thorough, and too well organized to be coincidental or the result of bureaucratic incompetence. Someone with considerable authority and resources had decided that certain information about the chamber should never reach the public or even the broader archaeological community, and that decision was implemented with remarkable efficiency. Key documents vanished from the British Museum's archives between 1925 and 1928, during a period when archival procedures were meticulously maintained and documented. These weren't minor papers or duplicate copies that might be casually misfiled. They were original field notes, photographic negatives, correspondence, and preliminary reports that should have been carefully preserved as part of the permanent collection. The museum's catalogue showed these items had been properly accessioned, following standard procedures, assigned reference numbers, and filed in secure storage. Then they simply ceased to exist, leaving gaps in the record that later archivists would notice and note in their reports, though the missing materials never resurfaced. The disappearance was surgical in its precision. Documents that mentioned the chamber's unusual properties vanished, while routine administrative paperwork about the expedition's funding and logistics remained intact. Photographs showing the chamber's interior disappeared, but images of the pyramid's exterior and the expedition camp survived. It was as though someone had carefully reviewed every document and removed only those that revealed too much about what had actually been found in that sealed stone room. Expedition members were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements in late 1923, unprecedented for archaeological work of that era. Academic freedom and open publication of findings were fundamental principles of scholarly research, values that the archaeological community held sacred. Yet every survivor received visits from museum officials, accompanied by solicitors who presented legal documents restricting what they could discuss publicly about their experiences. The agreements were comprehensive and punitive, specifying substantial financial penalties for violations and including clauses that prevented survivors from publishing articles, giving lectures, or even discussing their experiences in private correspondence that might be preserved in archives or libraries. Several survivors lost their academic positions when they attempted to write about the expedition despite these restrictions. Dr. James Whitmore was dismissed from his university post in 1925 after submitting an article to the Journal of Archaeological Studies describing the temporal anomalies. David Mills found himself unemployable in academic circles after attempting to present preliminary findings at a conference in Cambridge. The message was clear and brutally enforced. Silence would be maintained through economic pressure and professional destruction if legal threats proved insufficient. The Egyptian government refused all subsequent requests to study the chamber, citing various bureaucratic reasons that changed depending on who was asking and when. Sometimes officials declared the pyramid structurally unsound, despite engineering reports from multiple independent sources showing it was stable and safe to enter. Other times, authorities claimed the site was scheduled for restoration work that never materialized, a perpetual postponement that stretched across decades. Occasionally, bureaucrats insisted the chamber's exact location within the pyramid had been lost in administrative confusion. Though survey maps clearly and unambiguously showed its position, the explanations were inconsistent and often directly contradictory, suggesting the refusals reflected coordinated policy rather than genuine practical concerns. A researcher denied access in 1945 was told the pyramid was too dangerous to enter. That same researcher, applying again in 1947, was told the site was being prepared for tourism development and couldn't be disturbed. By 1950, the official explanation had changed again. Now, the chamber's location was uncertain, and further investigation would damage the pyramid's integrity. The shifting justifications revealed that the goal was simply to prevent access, with the specific reasoning being far less important than the ultimate result. Some researchers believe the authorities knew more than they admitted, that the chamber's effects had been observed before Blackwood's expedition and deliberately hidden from public knowledge. The parallel cases from 1884, 1901, and 1912 all followed remarkably similar patterns. Strange experiences in sealed chambers with unusual hieroglyphs, official investigations that went nowhere, and permanent closure followed by bureaucratic obstruction of further inquiry. The consistency across different administrations, different countries, and different decades suggested these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a longer history of encounters with spaces that fundamentally challenged our understanding of physical reality. If true, the question becomes profound and deeply unsettling. What are they protecting us from? Or, what are they protecting the chamber from? Is the secrecy designed to prevent dangerous knowledge from spreading, to avoid public panic about discoveries that undermine our understanding of time and space? Are authorities worried about the psychological damage to researchers who might enter the chamber, or about liability if expeditions end in madness or death? Or is something more active being protected? Are they keeping people away from a space where human presence itself might trigger consequences no one fully understands, where curious researchers might disturb or activate something that has been safely dormant behind its sealed gate for decades? The suppression continues to this day, suggesting that whatever concerns motivated the original cover-up remain valid nearly a century later. Among Whitmore's developed photographs were several that showed shadows where no shadows should exist, anomalies that photographic experts examined repeatedly without finding any conventional explanation. These images were among the most disturbing artifacts from the expedition, because they suggested the chamber contained phenomena that affected photographic emulsion differently than human perception, capturing visual information that should have been impossible given the documented lighting conditions. In the chamber, lit by electric lamps from multiple angles, specifically positioned to eliminate shadows for clear documentation purposes, certain areas remained dark despite direct illumination. Whitmore's lighting setup was professional and thorough. He had positioned 4 high-intensity lamps at different heights and angles to ensure uniform illumination throughout the space, a standard technique for archaeological photography. His exposure calculations, preserved in his meticulous notes, confirmed that every part of the chamber should have been adequately lit for proper photographic documentation. Yet the photographs showed patches of darkness that had no business existing given the recorded light levels and lamp positions. These shadows didn't correspond to any physical objects or people in the frame. Whitmore's documentation was comprehensive enough that researchers could reconstruct exactly what occupied each position in the chamber when photographs were taken. Team members' locations were noted in his log, equipment positions recorded, every object and artifact carefully catalogued. The shadows appeared in empty spaces where nothing stood to block light. Dark areas that basic geometry and optics insisted should have been brightly illuminated. Some shadows had sharp edges, as though cast by solid objects, yet no objects were present. Others had diffuse boundaries that suggested they weren't shadows at all in the conventional sense, but rather regions where light somehow failed to penetrate despite having clear paths from the lamps. In one particularly disturbing series, a shadow appeared to be moving, captured in different positions in sequential shots taken seconds apart according to Whitmore's timestamp notations. The shadow was roughly humanoid in shape, though indistinct and elongated in a way that suggested it wasn't cast by any normal three-dimensional object. In the first photograph, taken at 3:47 p.m. according to Whitmore's log, it stretched across the eastern wall, a dark silhouette approximately 6 feet tall. In the second image, captured 20 seconds later at 3:47 p.m. The timestamp was identical despite the elapsed time, suggesting Whitmore's watch had stopped or his time perception had been disrupted. In the third photograph, taken at what Whitmore recorded as 30 seconds after the second, the shadow had moved again, now positioned near where Dr. Chen had been working on her transcriptions. Photographic experts from Kodak examined the original glass plate negatives in 1948, searching for evidence that could explain these impossible images. They confirmed the negatives hadn't been manipulated in any way. The emulsion showed no signs of tampering, no scratches or alterations, no evidence of double exposure or darkroom techniques that could create such effects. The chemical analysis of the negatives showed they were genuine single exposures, developed using standard processes with no unusual treatments. The density of the shadowed areas on the negatives confirmed they represented genuine absence of light reaching the film, not artifacts introduced during development. The shadows simply existed in the chamber, visible to the camera but not reported by anyone present during the expedition. This discrepancy was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire phenomenon. If the shadows had been visible to the team, someone would have noted them, questioned them, investigated their source. Whitmore himself was meticulous about documenting anything unusual he observed, yet none of the expedition journals mentioned seeing unusual shadows during their time in the chamber. The phenomena appeared only in the photographs, suggesting they existed at a wavelength or in a manner that human eyes couldn't detect. But photographic emulsion could record, or perhaps that they were temporal rather than spatial phenomena. Shadows cast not by objects in space, but by events in time, visual echoes of presences that existed in the chamber at different moments, but were somehow captured simultaneously by the camera's exposure. Expedition geologist Thomas Wright's descent was the most complete and the most documented of all the survivors, providing researchers with a detailed chronicle of how the chamber's effects could progress and intensify over years rather than weeks. Hospital records from the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, where Wright spent his final 13 years from 1926 until his death in 1939, show he spent every waking hour drawing maps, thousands of them, filling page after page with obsessive architectural documentation that consumed his entire existence. Each map showed the chamber with additional rooms that hadn't existed during the physical expedition, spaces that no survey had detected and no team member had entered. These weren't vague impressions or abstract representations, but precise architectural drawings rendered with the technical skill of a trained geologist. Wright drew floor plans with measurements noted in feet and inches, elevation views showing wall heights and ceiling configurations, cross-sections revealing multiple levels of structure. He included details like doorway widths, corridor lengths, chamber volumes, and even architectural features like columns, niches, and stairs that descended to impossibly deep levels. But the maps were consistent with each other in remarkable and disturbing detail, as if Wright was documenting a real but invisible architecture that he alone could perceive. The central chamber appeared in every map, always accurate in its proportions and details, matching the actual space exactly as it had been measured during the expedition. The hieroglyphs on the walls were rendered precisely in Wright's drawings, their positions correct down to inches. This accuracy regarding the known space lent credibility to his depictions of the unknown spaces surrounding it, suggesting he wasn't fantasizing randomly, but documenting something he genuinely perceived, even if that perception was inaccessible to others. Surrounding this real room were additional chambers, passages, stairways, and spaces that extended in directions that should have led outside the pyramid's physical boundaries or deep into solid limestone that seismic surveys confirmed was unbroken stone. Wright drew rooms that should have been positioned in empty air outside the pyramid's walls. He mapped passages that descended hundreds of feet below the pyramid's foundation, far deeper than the bedrock allowed. He documented chambers that somehow existed within the same coordinates as solid stone, as though they occupied the same space but in different dimensions. When researchers overlaid Wright's maps in the 1,960 seconds, attempting to find patterns in his obsessive documentation, they discovered something extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The additional chambers formed a three-dimensional structure that looped back on itself in impossible ways that violated basic topology. Passages that led upward for dozens of feet eventually circled back to positions below their starting points without ever descending. Stairways that ascended continuously through multiple levels somehow terminated at their own beginning, creating closed loops in vertical space. Rooms that should have occupied the same physical coordinates existed in Wright's maps as distinct locations, as though space itself folded or multiplied in ways that allowed multiple chambers to coexist in identical positions. A mathematician named Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Margaret Chen from the original expedition, studied Wright's complete collection of maps in 1972, applying topological analysis to understand the structure he had documented. She noted that the maps resembled a Klein bottle, a mathematical shape that exists in four-dimensional space and has the remarkable property of having no distinct inside or outside. A Klein bottle is a closed surface with no boundary between interior and exterior, a structure that cannot exist in normal three-dimensional geometry but is perfectly valid in four dimensions. Wright's map suggested the chamber existed as a similar object, a space whose interior somehow extended beyond its exterior boundaries by occupying more than three spatial dimensions, creating an architecture that was internally consistent in higher dimensional space. The precision and consistency of Wright's work was remarkable given his deteriorating mental state. He maintained consistent scales across drawings, used proper architectural notation, and organized his maps into a cataloging system that would have made sense if the architecture he was documenting actually existed somewhere. He numbered each room sequentially, labeled passages with alphanumeric codes, noted distances and angles with geometric precision, and created index sheets that cross-referenced different views of the same spaces. Wright died in 1939, still drawing, his mind never recovering from whatever he had experienced in that sealed stone room. His final map, completed the day before his death and found on his bedside table, showed a chamber with no exit, a space completely sealed from the outside world, with no passages leading in or out, no doorways, no stairs, no connection to any other space. The drawing was labelled in his still precise handwriting simply, "Where I am," suggesting Wright believed his consciousness had become permanently trapped in a temporal or dimensional loop from which escape was impossible, that while his body remained in the hospital ward, his mind existed in a sealed room from which there was no return. His death, officially attributed to heart failure, might have been not just a physical end, but a final release from imprisonment in a space that existed beyond normal reality. In 1934, 11 years after the expedition, and after exhausting every medical avenue available, the family of survivor James Patterson hired Father Michael O'Brien to perform an exorcism. Patterson's condition had shown no improvement. Despite years of treatment, He continued his constant counting, experienced severe temporal disorientation that left him unable to maintain employment or relationships, and suffered periods of catatonia where he would stand motionless for hours staring at nothing visible to others. To his desperate family, who had watched him deteriorate for over a decade, these symptoms seemed more like spiritual possession than any mental illness modern medicine could identify or treat. Father O'Brien was an experienced priest who had devoted 30 years of ministry to cases of alleged demonic possession, performing dozens of exorcisms throughout England and developing a reputation for his careful, methodical approach to distinguishing genuine spiritual affliction from psychological illness. He arrived at Patterson's home in Surrey, expecting to encounter familiar signs of demonic influence: violent aversion to religious symbols, extreme reactions to holy water or blessed objects, speaking in languages the possessed person had never studied, demonstration of knowledge about hidden events or private information the person couldn't normally access, and the characteristic personality changes that suggested an external entity had taken control. Instead, he found something entirely outside his theological framework and pastoral experience. Patterson showed none of the typical signs of possession O'Brien had learned to recognize over his decades of ministry. He didn't recoil from crucifixes or show any distress at religious imagery. He remained calm when blessed water was sprinkled on him. He showed no supernatural strength or violent tendencies when prayers were recited. He didn't speak in unknown languages or demonstrate impossible knowledge. His personality hadn't been supplanted by something foreign and hostile. He remained recognizably himself, simply unable to function normally in time. Instead, Patterson seemed what the priest later described in his report as occupied by time itself, as if something in the chamber had imprinted a pattern on his consciousness that wouldn't fade regardless of spiritual intervention or medical treatment. Father O'Brien wrote that Patterson appeared to exist partially outside the normal flow of moments, as though part of him remained perpetually in that ancient chamber, while his body moved through ordinary time. The exorcism itself followed traditional Catholic ritual, with O'Brien reciting prayers in Latin from the Roman ritual, sprinkling holy water, making the sign of the cross, and invoking divine protection against demonic forces. Patterson remained calm throughout the ceremony, showing neither the resistance that would suggest demonic presence, nor the relief that would indicate spiritual liberation. He sat quietly, his eyes unfocused and distant, his lips moving silently in the counting pattern that had characterized his behavior for 11 years. But Father O'Brien noticed something curious during the recitation of prayers. Patterson was counting silently with remarkable precision, his lips moving in exact rhythm, with the Latin words being spoken, though his eyes remained distant, and he showed no other sign of engagement with the ceremony. At first, O'Brien assumed this was just the manifestation of Patterson's obsessive counting behavior during a stressful situation, but as he continued through the ritual, paying closer attention to the subtle movements of Patterson's lips, the priest realized something extraordinary was happening. Patterson was counting in ancient Egyptian numbering systems, phonetically matching the prayers syllable for syllable and creating a kind of numerical translation of the Latin words in real time. Each Latin word was being converted into its Egyptian mathematical equivalent, the pronunciation correct for Middle Egyptian numerals, and the correspondence between Latin syllables and Egyptian number words, precise and consistent. O'Brien, who had studied ancient languages during his seminary training, recognized enough of the Egyptian phonetics to understand what was happening, and the realization stopped him mid-prayer. This was remarkable because Patterson had no formal training in Egyptian languages or numbering systems. His background was in civil engineering, focused on bridge construction and structural mechanics. He had never studied ancient Egypt beyond casual reading, had never learned hieroglyphics or hieratic script, had no exposure to Egyptian mathematical notation or pronunciation, yet he was performing complex linguistic translation automatically, unconsciously. Without any apparent awareness he was doing so, converting Latin prayers into Egyptian numerical equivalents, as though his mind had been programmed to execute this translation, regardless of his conscious knowledge or intent. Father O'Brien stopped the exorcism, recognizing he was dealing with something beyond his theological training or pastoral experience. In his final report to Patterson's family, delivered with evident reluctance and uncertainty, he wrote that Patterson's condition represented a soul caught between moments, unable to fully exist in any single time, and that what afflicted him was not demonic possession but something else entirely, perhaps, he suggested carefully, a natural phenomenon that existed outside both scientific and religious frameworks, something ancient peoples had encountered and tried to understand, using the conceptual tools available to them, something that modern theology was no better equipped to address than modern medicine had been. A 1,998 satellite survey using advanced ground-penetrating radar technology revealed something new about the Dashur pyramid that would fundamentally recontextualize everything. Chamber and its place within the larger structure. The survey was conducted as part of a broader Egyptian government project to document and preserve archaeological sites using modern remote sensing capabilities, with satellites equipped with synthetic aperture radar making multiple passes over sites to create detailed three-dimensional maps of subsurface features, invisible from ground level. The chamber the expedition had entered in 1923 was clearly visible on the scans, showing as an expected void within the limestone structure at precisely the location historical records and architectural surveys indicated. The radar clearly delineated its 30-foot square dimensions, its position approximately 60 feet above the pyramid's base, and its relationship to the known passages and internal architecture. This confirmed what researchers already knew and validated the accuracy of the scanning technology. But the radar revealed something unprecedented that had never been detected by any previous survey or investigation. Surrounding the known chamber were several other chambers arranged in a symmetrical pattern, spaces that showed no entrances, no passages connecting them to the known structure or to each other, no access routes that would have allowed ancient builders to construct them or modern researchers to explore them. They simply existed within what should have been solid stone, geometrically impossible yet clearly visible on the scans as distinct voids with regular, architectural shapes rather than natural geological features. Each phantom chamber measured approximately the same dimensions as the known chamber, roughly 30 feet square, with similar proportions, and they were positioned at regular intervals around the central space like petals around a flower's center or satellites orbiting a central body. The spacing was mathematically precise, with each chamber positioned exactly 60 degrees apart when viewed from above, creating a perfect hexagonal pattern. The symmetry was too exact to be natural, too deliberate to be coincidental. This was clearly intentional architecture, designed according to geometric principles and built with precision that matched the finest examples of ancient Egyptian engineering. Ground-penetrating radar doesn't create false positives about empty spaces. The technology reliably distinguishes between solid material and voids by measuring how electromagnetic pulses reflect differently from stone versus air. The scans showed definite empty chambers where solid limestone should exist according to all previous surveys and understanding of the pyramid's structure. These weren't shadows or artifacts of the scanning process, but genuine architectural voids, spaces that physically existed within the pyramid, despite having no apparent access or connection to any known passage. When engineers analyzed the data more carefully, studying the three-dimensional models and examining the chamber's relationships from multiple perspectives, they realized the chambers formed a pattern when viewed from above, a kind of three-dimensional symbol that only had meaning when the entire structure was considered as a single geometric form. The pattern wasn't obvious from ground level or even from examining individual chambers in isolation, but from the satellite's overhead perspective, with all 7 chambers visible simultaneously, It became unmistakable. A specific arrangement of spaces creating a complex symbol, written not in ink or carved in stone, but constructed in the architecture of empty space itself. The pattern matched one of the hieroglyphs. Chen had transcribed from the chamber walls 75 years earlier. A complex symbol she had noted appeared repeatedly in the inscriptions, but whose meaning she had never been able to determine. The symbol showed a central point surrounded by 6 peripheral points in a hexagonal arrangement, with lines connecting them in specific patterns that Chen had thought might represent astronomical alignments or mathematical relationships. Now it appeared the symbol was architectural, a literal 3-dimensional representation of the pyramid's hidden internal structure. A hieroglyph written at the scale of rooms, rather than carved at the scale of inches. The entire pyramid structure, or at least this portion of it, was apparently designed to create a 3-dimensional representation of a single hieroglyph, a symbol written not in the traditional 2-dimensional form, but as actual architecture that could only be fully perceived from above. The chamber where Blackwood's team had suffered their temporal distortions was just the center of a larger symbolic structure whose full purpose remained mysterious and profoundly unsettling, suggesting the ancient builders had encoded meaning at scales and in dimensions far beyond what traditional archaeology had ever considered possible. A disturbing pattern emerged in the descendants of expedition members over the decades following 1923, suggesting the chamber's effects might extend beyond those who had physically entered it. Several children and grandchildren of survivors reported experiencing similar symptoms of temporal disorientation. Despite never having been near the Dashur pyramid themselves, never having set foot in Egypt, and in some cases being born years after the expedition had concluded, these second and third generation cases described feeling unstuck in time, a phrase several used independently without knowing others had employed the same language. They experienced memories of events that hadn't happened yet, vivid recollections of conversations that would occur weeks later, detailed knowledge of news events before they were reported, clear memories of outcomes that hadn't yet transpired. When these predicted events actually occurred, the experiences matched their memories with disturbing accuracy. Others reported remembering the same day multiple times, as though they were living through identical temporal loops, but retaining memories from previous iterations. They would wake knowing exactly what would happen that day, because they had, in some sense, already lived it. Some described this as deeply disorienting. Others learned to navigate it, using their temporal knowledge to avoid accidents or capitalize on opportunities, though this pragmatic approach often led to deeper psychological disturbances, as the boundary between prediction and memory dissolved completely. Psychiatrists who examined these cases found no genetic basis for these conditions. Nothing in family medical histories or DNA analysis that would explain transmission across generations. The descendants showed no neurological abnormalities, no brain lesions or structural differences that could account for their symptoms. Their brain chemistry was normal, their cognitive functions unimpaired. Yet they experienced temporal phenomena identical to what their ancestors had reported after emerging from the chamber. One researcher, Dr. Helena Vasquez of the Institute for Consciousness Studies, proposed in 2005 that the expedition members had been changed at a quantum level. Their DNA somehow encoded with the chamber's effects. She suggested that quantum information about the temporal distortions might have become entangled with the survivors' genetic material, creating a kind of hereditary memory that passed to offspring. The chamber's influence, she argued, wasn't just psychological but physical, altering the fundamental information structure of human cells. This theory was widely dismissed as pseudoscience by mainstream researchers, who pointed out that quantum effects don't typically persist at biological temperatures and scales, and that DNA doesn't encode experiential information in ways that could produce these symptoms. Yet Vasquez's theory remained the only explanation that attempted to account for the transgenerational transmission of such specific temporal distortions. The phenomenon raised profound questions about the nature of the chamber's effects. If exposure could alter someone so fundamentally that their descendants inherited the changes, what did this suggest about what had actually happened in that stone room? Were the survivors carrying something forward in their very cells? Some imprint of the chamber that could be passed biologically to future generations? And if so, how many descendants might now carry this temporal sensitivity, walking through the world with an inherited connection to a space that had warped time itself 75 years before their birth? The scarab found in Whitmore's pocket after his rescue was eventually analysed in 2003 using modern dating techniques unavailable during previous examinations. A team at Oxford's Research Laboratory for Archaeology subjected the artefact to radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescence analysis, and various spectroscopic methods to determine its age and origin. The results were impossible, contradicting everything archaeologists understood about Egyptian chronology and craftsmanship. The stone itself tested to approximately 12,000 years old, dating to the end of the last ice age when Egypt was still emerging from the African humid period. But the carving style matched the 4th dynasty around 2600 BCE, displaying artistic conventions and technical characteristics that wouldn't develop for another 7,000 years. It was as though someone from the Pyramid Age had carved an object from stone that was already ancient when Egypt's first dynasties emerged. More puzzling, the stone contained trace elements that didn't match any known Egyptian quarry, ancient or modern. Geologists had catalogued the mineral signatures of every major stone source used in ancient Egypt. The granite from Aswan, the limestone from Tura, the basalt from various volcanic outcrops. The scarab's composition matched none of them. Spectrographic analysis suggested it came from a source that no longer exists, perhaps exhausted and lost to history, or from a location that hasn't been discovered despite modern geological surveys. When researchers placed the scarab under different wavelengths of light, ultraviolet, infrared, various frequencies across the electromagnetic spectrum, additional hieroglyphs became visible on its surface. These symbols didn't appear under normal visible light, existing only when illuminated by specific wavelengths. They appeared and disappeared depending on the angle and spectrum of illumination, as though multiple layers of inscription existed in the same physical space, each visible only under particular conditions. The hidden hieroglyphs matched some of the symbols Dr. Chen had transcribed from the chamber walls, the ones that had no correspondence to known Egyptian writing. Under UV light, the scarab showed temporal coordinate symbols, the mathematical notation for time measurements that researchers had identified in the chamber inscriptions. Under infrared, different symbols appeared, warning signs in archaic Egyptian that predated the development of formal hieroglyphic writing. Most disturbing was what happened when the scarab was illuminated with polarized light. Additional inscriptions became visible. But these weren't static. They appeared to move, flowing across the stone's surface like liquid, rearranging themselves into different configurations. Video recordings of this phenomenon showed the symbols shifting position over the course of seconds, though the stone itself remained motionless and unchanged. The effect was reproducible. Researchers could trigger it reliably by using polarized light at specific angles, but inexplicable. Stone shouldn't be able to display moving text, yet somehow this ancient artifact managed exactly that. The scarab remained in the British Museum's restricted collection, catalogued but not displayed, its impossible properties documented but not understood. Its existence raised questions that undermined comfortable assumptions about ancient Egyptian capabilities and the linear nature of time itself. Studies conducted near the sealed entrance in 2001 as part of Egypt's Archaeological Site Preservation Initiative revealed unusual magnetic properties that added another layer to the chamber's mysteries. The research team, equipped with sensitive magnetometers and other instruments, discovered that the iron gate welded across the entrance in 1956 had become magnetized, though not in any consistent or explicable pattern. The magnetization wasn't uniform. Some sections of the gate showed North Pole orientation, while adjacent areas showed South Pole orientation, with the polarities seemingly distributed randomly across the metal surface. This shouldn't have occurred naturally. Iron exposed to Earth's magnetic field typically develops consistent magnetization aligned with the planet's magnetic poles. The chaotic pattern suggested the gate had been exposed to multiple powerful magnetic fields from different directions, or to a single field that somehow varied in orientation across short distances. Compasses brought within 10 meters of the entrance would spin erratically, sometimes pointing toward the chamber, sometimes away from it, sometimes rotating continuously, without settling on any direction. The effect was reproducible but unpredictable. Researchers couldn't determine in advance which behavior a compass would display. Some compasses would spin clockwise, others counterclockwise. Still others would oscillate back and forth in specific arcs, as though responding to a magnetic field that pulsed or alternated. Magnetometers showed flux readings that changed not with time, as would be expected from normal magnetic field fluctuations, but with the position of the observer. A magnetometer held at waist height showed different readings than one held at chest height, despite being separated by only a few feet vertically. Readings also changed based on where the observer stood relative to the entrance, suggesting the magnetic field was somehow responding to human proximity or presence. One physicist, Dr. James Chen of Cairo University, noted in his report that the readings resembled what you might expect if the chamber existed in a different gravitational frame than its surroundings. In Einstein's general relativity, strong gravitational fields affect electromagnetism in predictable ways. The magnetic anomalies around the chamber entrance matched theoretical predictions for a region where space-time curvature was significantly different from the surrounding area, as though the chamber existed in a localized gravitational well that shouldn't be possible given Earth's mass and the absence of any massive objects nearby. The implications were profound and disturbing. If the chamber did exist in a different gravitational frame, this would explain the temporal distortions. Gravity and time are intimately connected in relativistic physics, with stronger gravitational fields causing time to flow more slowly. But creating such a localized gravitational anomaly would require technology or knowledge far beyond ancient Egyptian capabilities, or perhaps beyond modern capabilities. The chamber, it seemed, was manipulating space-time itself, creating a bubble of altered physics that persisted even through the sealed iron gate that blocked physical access to the space beyond. Dr. Sarah Morrison's complete psychiatric evaluation of the survivors, compiled over 5 years of intensive study from 1923 to 1928, was never published, despite being the most comprehensive analysis of the expedition's psychological effects. Her draft report, discovered in her personal papers after her death in 1971, contained conclusions that the British Medical Association refused to endorse and actively suppressed. Morrison argued that the survivors hadn't gone mad in any traditional sense that psychiatry understood. Their memories, though temporally confused, were internally consistent. Their perceptions, while altered, showed systematic patterns rather than random delusions. She documented how survivors could perform complex tasks, maintain relationships, and function in society despite their temporal disorientation, suggesting their fundamental cognitive capabilities remained intact. Instead, Morrison proposed, their perception of reality had been altered, expanded to include dimensions of time that human consciousness wasn't evolved or equipped to process. She compared them to people who had developed a new sense, like sight in someone born blind, but without the mental framework, language, or conceptual tools to interpret what they were perceiving. A blind person suddenly given sight would experience overwhelming confusion, unable to understand depth, perspective, or visual patterns without extensive training. The survivors, Morrison argued, had developed temporal sight, the ability to perceive past, present, and future as simultaneous dimensions, but had no framework for organizing or understanding these perceptions. She wrote, We call them mad because they describe experiences we cannot share, perceptions we cannot verify. But what if they are simply perceiving accurately a broader spectrum of reality than the rest of us? What if the chamber didn't damage their minds but expanded them beyond the normal human range, like a radio receiver suddenly able to pick up frequencies it was never designed to process? Morrison documented specific cases that supported her theory. Several survivors made predictions about future events with unsettling accuracy, suggesting they weren't hallucinating but actually perceiving future time. Others described past events they couldn't have known about through normal means, but which archival research confirmed had occurred exactly as they described. Their temporal confusion wasn't random, it was systematic, as though they were navigating a four-dimensional reality without the three-dimensional constraints that normally bound human consciousness. The report was deemed speculative and unhelpful by the British Medical Association's Review Committee in 1929. The committee's official response stated that Morrison's conclusions departed from established psychiatric principles and could not be supported by empirical evidence. They refused to allow publication in any medical journal under their influence, effectively blacklisting the research from mainstream psychiatric discourse. Morrison herself was quietly pressured to abandon this line of inquiry, with subtle suggestions that continued pursuit of these theories might harm her professional standing. She complied, publicly at least, though her private papers show she never stopped believing her analysis was correct. The report remains unpublished to this day, housed in the British Medical Association's archives under restricted access, a testament to knowledge that institutional medicine found too threatening to acknowledge. In 2011, a graduate researcher named Thomas Walsh found a file misfiled in the British Museum archives while conducting unrelated research on Egyptian mortuary practices. The file was dated 1924, wedged between folders documenting routine administrative correspondence about artifact loans and exhibition planning. It contained a letter from an anonymous Egyptian official, written in English with the careful precision of someone for whom English was a learned language rather than a native tongue. The letter warned that the Dashur chamber was known to local tradition as the room where time sleeps, a name that had been preserved in oral histories passed down through generations of families living near the pyramid. Complex. According to the official, this wasn't merely superstition or folklore, but represented genuine traditional knowledge about the chamber's nature that predated any modern archaeological investigation. The letter explained that the chamber had been deliberately sealed in antiquity, not to protect what was inside. There was no treasure, no royal burial, no sacred objects requiring preservation, but to protect the outside world from it. The ancient Egyptians, according to this tradition, had understood that the chamber was dangerous, that it affected people in ways that couldn't be cured or reversed. They had sealed it as one might seal a well that produced poisoned water, not to protect the well, but to protect those who might drink from it. According to the official, similar chambers existed throughout Egypt, all sealed by ancient builders who recognized their dangerous properties, all avoided by local populations who retained cultural memory of what these spaces could do to human consciousness. The official claimed knowledge of at least 7 such chambers, scattered from the Delta to Aswan, each identified in local tradition by similar names: the room that doesn't end, the place where yesterday returns, the chamber of broken time. The letter ended with a direct and urgent plea that the chamber remain closed, that some doors are meant to stay locked, that certain knowledge from the ancient world was sealed away for good reasons that remained valid across millennia. The official wrote, "Your scientists believe they can study anything safely if they bring proper equipment and use correct procedures. But there are some things that cannot be studied safely because the act of observation itself causes harm. The chamber is such a thing. It was sealed by people who understood this. Please, I beg you, respect their wisdom and leave it sealed." The museum never responded to the letter. At least no response exists in the archives. Whether the letter was dismissed as superstitious nonsense from a minor official, or whether it was taken seriously but deemed not worthy of formal reply, remains unknown. The Egyptian official who sent it remains anonymous. The letter bore no signature, no official stamp, nothing that would identify its author or verify their authority to speak about such matters. It exists as a lone voice of warning, ignored or dismissed, filed away and forgotten, until Walsh's accidental discovery 87 years later brought it back to light. Medical examination of the survivors revealed an unusual phenomenon that physicians dubbed temporal dysregulation syndrome, though this name barely captured the bizarre nature of what they observed. Their circadian rhythms were disrupted, but not in the typical patterns associated with jet lag, shift work, or any known sleep disorder. The disruption was far more fundamental and far more strange. Instead of operating on a single disrupted cycle that might gradually normalize, their bodies seemed to be operating on multiple overlapping cycles simultaneously, as though different biological systems were following different clocks entirely. They would feel the need to sleep at inconsistent times that followed no discernible pattern, sometimes requiring sleep multiple times within a single day, sometimes remaining wakeful for days without apparent exhaustion. Their sleep-wake cycles bore no relationship to light exposure, meal times, or any external cues that normally entrain human circadian rhythms. Their metabolic rates fluctuated wildly in ways that defied physiological understanding. Basal metabolic rate typically remains relatively stable in healthy adults, varying only slightly with activity level, illness, or aging. But the survivors' metabolic rates would spike and plummet seemingly at random, sometimes burning calories at rates consistent with intense physical activity while they sat motionless, other times dropping to levels that should have produced hypothermia and unconsciousness while they remained alert and active. Most puzzling and most disturbing to the physicians studying them, their cellular aging appeared irregular in ways that shouldn't be biologically possible. Tissue samples examined under microscopy showed that some cells displayed advanced aging, shortened telomeres, accumulated DNA damage, cellular senescence markers, while adjacent cells remained young and healthy, showing characteristics typical of much younger tissue. It was as if different parts of their bodies were experiencing time at different rates, aging decades while neighboring tissues aged only years, or remained effectively unchanged. Blood tests revealed similar inconsistencies. Some blood cells showed markers indicating they were weeks old when they should have been days old. Other cells appeared impossibly young, as though they had been produced hours before when they should have been replaced days earlier through normal hematopoiesis. The survivors' bodies seemed to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, each system operating according to its own timeline rather than coordinated biological synchrony. Medical science had no explanation for these phenomena, no framework for understanding how a single organism could display such radically different aging rates in different tissues. Some doctors suggested the chamber had somehow desynchronized their biological clocks, disrupting the master pacemaker neurons in the suprachiasmatic nucleus that normally coordinate all circadian rhythms throughout the body. But this theory couldn't explain the differential aging, the cellular-level temporal discordance that suggested something far more fundamental than disrupted circadian signaling. Dr. Patricia Chambers, a chronobiologist who studied 3 survivors in 1955, proposed that the chamber had somehow altered their relationship to time at a cellular level, making their bodies subject to different temporal flows than the external world. She wrote in her notes, "It's as though each cell maintains its own temporal inertia, some running fast, some slow, some in sync with external time and others completely disconnected from it. The body as a unified temporal structure has been shattered into fragments, each experiencing duration differently." In 2015, an international team of archaeologists, physicists, and engineers proposed a new expedition to the Dashur chamber that would avoid direct human exposure while still gathering comprehensive data about the space's properties. led by Dr. Robert Ashford of MIT and Dr. Yasmin Hassan of Cairo University. The team designed an ambitious plan using remote-controlled robots equipped with advanced sensors, high-definition cameras, atmospheric analyzers, and equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, radiation levels, gravitational variations, and temporal distortions. The proposal outlined how the robots would enter through a small opening in the sealed gate, avoiding the need to remove the barrier that had protected the chamber since 1956. The machines would map the space using LiDAR scanning, photograph every surface in multiple wavelengths, collect air samples, measure magnetic and gravitational anomalies, and deploy atomic clocks to detect temporal distortions. The entire operation would be conducted remotely, with no human closer than 100 meters to the chamber entrance, ensuring safety while still allowing comprehensive scientific investigation. The Egyptian government denied the request without explanation, within 48 hours of its submission, an unusually rapid response for bureaucratic processes that typically required months of review. When the team persisted, submitting revised proposals that addressed potential concerns about site preservation and offering to share all data with Egyptian authorities, they received a more direct response. An unofficial warning arrived through channels that couldn't be officially traced, stating that any attempt to enter the chamber would result in permanent ban from all Egyptian archaeological sites for every team member and their affiliated institutions. The warning was specific and threatening, mentioning team members by name and noting their previous work in Egypt, suggesting detailed surveillance and serious intent to enforce the prohibition. The message came from a department that didn't appear in any official organizational chart of the Antiquities Service, a branch rumored among archaeologists to track and suppress information about Egypt's most unusual sites. Dr. Hassan, who had extensive contacts within Egyptian archaeological administration, made discreet inquiries about this mysterious department. She learned unofficially that certain sites throughout Egypt were under special protection, monitored by a division that operated outside normal administrative structures and reported directly to officials whose names never appeared in public records. These sites, according to her contacts, weren't protected because of their historical value or preservation needs, but because of specific dangers they posed, not physical dangers like unstable structures, but something else. Something her contacts wouldn't specify clearly, even in private conversations. The team abandoned their proposal after considering the implications. Some mysteries, they concluded after lengthy deliberation, might be better left unsolved, Dr. Ashford wrote in his private journal. We could probably force the issue, generate international pressure, embarrass Egypt into granting access. But the fear in Hassan's contacts' eyes when they warned her off suggests something more than bureaucratic territorialism. Perhaps some knowledge really is too dangerous. Perhaps the ancients who sealed that chamber understood something we've forgotten about the limits of what should be investigated. A mathematical analysis in 2018, conducted by Dr. Emily Zhang of Cambridge's Department of Pure Mathematics, examined the chamber's proportions using modern topology and non-Euclidean geometry. Zhang had obtained detailed measurements from the various surveys conducted over the decades and subjected them to analysis using mathematical tools that hadn't existed when the chamber was first discovered. The results suggested something that should have been impossible. The chamber's geometry was non-Euclidean, containing angles and spatial relationships that shouldn't exist in normal three-dimensional space. Using topological analysis, Zhang discovered that the sum of angles in certain triangular sections of the chamber exceeded 180 degrees, a fundamental impossibility in flat Euclidean space. In normal geometry, the angles of any triangle always sum to exactly 180 degrees, but the chamber's proportions, measured repeatedly and verified across multiple independent surveys, contain triangular relationships that sum to 181.7 degrees, as though the space itself was curved in a way that shouldn't be possible in Earth's relatively flat gravitational field. The chamber also exhibited what Zhang termed inconsistent metrics. The distance between 2 points changed depending on the path taken to measure it, violating the basic assumption that space is uniform and consistent. A measurement from corner A to corner B along the north wall yielded a different result than the same measurement along the south wall. Despite both paths covering what should have been the same geometric distance, the discrepancy was small, only a few centimeters, but measurable and reproducible across different surveys using different equipment. Zhang proposed that the chamber might be a three-dimensional slice of a higher dimensional structure, similar to how a two-dimensional being living on the surface of a sheet of paper might perceive a three-dimensional cube passing through their plane of existence. The two-dimensional being would see only the cross-section of square that appeared, existed briefly, and disappeared, never comprehending the full three-dimensional structure of which it was a part. If the chamber existed as a cross-section of a four-dimensional or higher dimensional structure, its interior space could extend into dimensions inaccessible to normal three-dimensional perception. This would explain the architectural impossibilities, rooms that couldn't fit within the pyramid's boundaries, measurements that didn't add up correctly, spaces that seemed larger inside than outside. These weren't illusions or measurement errors, but genuine properties of a space that existed partially in dimensions humans couldn't directly perceive. If true, Zhang argued, this would explain the psychological effects experienced by expedition members. Human minds evolved to process 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, the basic framework of space-time as we normally experience it. The chamber might contain more dimensions than this, perhaps additional spatial dimensions, perhaps multiple temporal dimensions, perhaps geometries that blurred the distinction between space and time entirely. Exposure to such higher dimensional geometry would overwhelm human consciousness, which has no evolutionary framework for processing additional dimensions. The brain would struggle to construct a coherent reality model from sensory input that violated all normal geometric and temporal assumptions. The result would be exactly what the survivors experienced: temporal disorientation, visual distortions, the sense of spaces being larger than they should be, the perception of objects existing in multiple locations simultaneously. Zhang's paper, published in the Journal of Theoretical Topology, concluded with an observation that bordered on the philosophical. If consciousness is a geometric phenomenon, a pattern that emerges from the specific spatial and temporal structure of neural processing, then exposing that consciousness to incompatible geometries might fundamentally alter its nature. The expedition members may not have gone mad. They may have been temporarily reshaped into minds capable of perceiving higher dimensions without the context or stability to maintain such perception. The chamber doesn't just occupy space. It defines space in ways that transform whatever consciousness enters it. The last surviving member of the Blackwood expedition died in 2003 at the age of 106, outliving all his colleagues by decades. David Mills, the assistant archaeologist who had been the first to show symptoms of temporal disorientation after the expedition, had lived longer than any reasonable medical prediction would have suggested, given his history of psychological trauma and decades of institutionalization. His longevity itself was curious, as though some effect from the chamber had altered not just his perception of time, but his biological relationship to it. In his final years, Mills gave several interviews about the expedition to researchers studying the incident's long-term effects. His memory of the events remained remarkably sharp, despite his advanced age and the 8 decades that had passed since that February in 1923. He could recall specific details, the exact position of hieroglyphs on the chamber walls, the smell of limestone dust and lamp oil, the sensation of temporal displacement when he first noticed time behaving strangely. His recollections were consistent with the written records, suggesting that whatever the chamber had done to his mind, it hadn't impaired his memory formation or retrieval. Though Mills maintained his clarity about what had happened, he admitted he could never fully explain what he'd experienced in that stone room. "Language fails," he told one interviewer in 2001. We have words for space left, right, up, down, forward, backward. We have one word for time forward, always forward. But the chamber had more directions than that. I experienced movements through time that have no names, sensations of temporal navigation that I can't describe because English never developed vocabulary for them. It's like trying to explain colour to someone born blind, or trying to describe a dream that made perfect sense while dreaming but dissolves into nonsense when you try to put it into words. When asked if he would enter the chamber again, knowing what he knew about its effects and the decades of disrupted life that followed, the question seemed to reach something deep within him, touching on thoughts he'd carried for 80 years. Finally, he responded with words that the interviewer would later describe as the most disturbing statement he'd ever heard from a research subject. "In my dreams, I never left," Mills said quietly, his eyes focused on something distant and invisible. "Part of me is still there, still counting, still trying to understand what I was perceiving. The chamber doesn't let you leave. Not really. Not completely. It just lets you move your body away while a piece of your consciousness remains trapped in that space, eternally trying to process an experience that human minds weren't designed to process. Every night when I sleep, I'm back there, standing in that stone room, watching time pool and eddy around me like water. I've been there for 80 years, and I'll be there after this body dies." The chamber keeps what it touches. Mills died 3 months after that interview. In his sleep, with no apparent cause, the attending physician noted that he had been counting quietly in his final moments, his lips moving in the now familiar pattern that had characterized his entire post-expedition life, enumerating sequences that held meaning only to him and to whatever part of reality the chamber had connected him to. Today, the Dashur pyramid stands weathered and silent in the Egyptian desert, its iron gate rusted but secure, a barrier that has held for nearly 7 decades. No tourists visit this site, no tour buses pull into the parking area that was constructed but never used, no archaeological teams request access, having learned through professional networks that such requests are futile and potentially career-damaging. The pyramid appears on maps but not in guidebooks, acknowledged to exist but quietly discouraged as a destination. The local population still calls it the House of Shadows, a name that predates Blackwood's expedition by centuries and persists despite modernization and education. Families living in nearby villages give the pyramid a wide berth after dark, and children are taught not to play near its base. This isn't superstition in the dismissive sense, but traditional knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that something about this particular pyramid makes it different from the others, something that makes it dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with physical hazards, like unstable stones or sudden collapses. Occasionally, the guards posted at the site report unusual phenomena in their shift logs, observations that are filed and noted, but never officially investigated. They describe the sound of counting coming from within the sealed chamber, faint but distinct, a voice or multiple voices enumerating in rhythms that don't quite match human speech patterns. They report shadows moving inside the pyramid when no light source could possibly cast them. Dark shapes that appear in the narrow gaps around the sealed gate, visible for moments before fading back into deeper darkness. Most persistently, guards report the feeling of being watched by something that exists just outside the normal flow of time. A presence that isn't hostile but isn't benign, either merely observant, patient, eternal. They describe an awareness that makes them uncomfortable, a sense that something is paying attention to them from a place or time they can't access. Studying them with interest that feels older than human civilization, whether the chamber contains ancient secrets or ancient warnings, whether it's a door to knowledge or a door that should never be opened, remains unknown and perhaps unknowable. The Egyptian government maintains its silence, neither confirming nor denying the chamber's properties, neither permitting investigation nor explaining why investigation is forbidden. The few researchers who still study the Blackwood expedition work with incomplete records, suppressed data, and the knowledge that certain questions are dangerous to ask too loudly. Some doors, perhaps, are sealed not to keep us out, but to keep something else in, not a physical entity or a conscious threat, but something more fundamental and more dangerous. A piece of space and time that behaves wrongly, a geometric anomaly that transforms whatever consciousness encounters it, a temporal trap that catches minds and holds them across decades or centuries. The chamber waits, patient and unchanging, behind its rusted gate, in its sealed pyramid, in the desert that has kept its secrets for 5,000 years and shows no inclination to surrender them now. The warning that remains is simple and has echoed across millennia from the ancient builders who first sealed the chamber. Some spaces exist that human minds cannot safely enter. Some knowledge exists that human consciousness cannot safely process. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again, not because they refuse to shut, but because they leave part of us behind, trapped forever in moments that never end and geometries that never resolve.